Cause you're listening to Jams and Tea, you won't see the show on your TV, so we talk about things musically. Cause you're listening to Jams and Tea, listening to Jams and Tea. Welcome everybody to a brand new episode of the Jams and Tea podcast where we spin the jams and spill the tea. Today we are doing another discography deep dive. We are doing the discography of a band called the Antlers, who are releasing a new album soon that we are going to cover on here. So we figured it would be best to cover their entire career because we all four of us have a bit of history with this band and have attached ourselves to these records. We all love some of these records intensely, and there's a lot of interesting things to talk about them. And today we are also joined by a podcast veteran, first time ever guest on a discography episode. We have Zach with us today. Woohoo.
Let's fucking go.
Hi, everybody.
Welcome, Zach.
Yeah.
So the Antlers are an interesting group, have had an interesting career arc and an interesting story. Definitely a case of an indie band or an indie act coming to prominence at the right place at the right time, from very humble beginnings. The project started out in the early 2000s as just a solo venture for vocalist and guitarist Peter Silberman. Released a series of EPs and singles, I think, in these early days. And then Uprooted, their very first album, was released in October 2006. It was, as I said, it's self-released and recorded entirely by Silberman himself. So at this point, it's still a solo project. One interesting fact about this record and about the Antlers as an act early in their career is that Peter has said they were inspired heavily by Phil Elverum and the home recordings of the microphones. And in fact, a little bit of a extra fact here, the band name, the Antlers, comes from a deep cut microphones track called Antlers that was never on any of their major album releases. So the songs on Uprooted feel very much like sketches. They show the seeds of how Peter would develop his emotionally urgent, heavy but dreamy sound on the records to come. It's a lo-fi beginning through and through, but the promise is definitely there. A track like First Field opens with a looping guitar melody that to me reminded me of Fleet Foxes, despite predating all of their music. And I think that is an interesting point because it's an early indication of perhaps this record wasn't particularly influential, but this signifier is an early indication of the influence that the Antlers would have on a considerable swath of indie pitchfork core culture as they become a more successful act. And that will be a part of the narrative and a part of the discussion that we have about the legacy of this band. But anyway, First Field is a gentle entry into their discography. Keys sees Peter repeating lines like, "I can't sleep in the waiting room," and "I can't stand on only one leg," which both of those lines hint at very specific themes and metaphors that the band would use to interrogate relationships on Hospice. So I think it's quite interesting. You get the sort of seeds of that in certain respects here. Nashua is one of the highlights of the record, in my opinion, a gently sad ballad that has some of the strongest melodies and the fullest form of anything here. It feels like a traditional indie folk song in the best way.
And I think it shares a chord progression with a refrain that comes up several times through Hospice. I was listening to it on the way over here, and I think that particular song has a melodic progression that is on Sylvia. Someone might know better than me.
Yeah, you might actually be onto something there, and that's an interesting point as well, because that's a record where you do have these repetitive melodic motifs that circle throughout it and are used to, I think, and we'll talk about this when we talk about Hospice, but you have these melodic motifs that are used to represent particular themes or like scenes or things that are happening within the relationship that record's detailing. So I wouldn't be surprised if the seeds of that idea of the melodic motif representing the feeling or the situation are being set into place here on this early record. The wordless oohing vocals that open "It Seems Easy" reminded me of Sufjan Stevens' Futile Devices. But the song has a sort of stilted sea shanty rhythm that reminded me of a Decemberist track. Then you have the title track, which is the most measured piece here. It's a gently muted folk anthem that balloons into something huge and heart-wrenching across its 6-minute runtime. I think it's the first indication of the interest that Peter and the band would have in more kind of ambitious compositions that kind of build and sort of have multiple different sections and stuff, and you get a real ballooning of that on the very next record already. And then you have I'm Hibernating, which is an equally sad ending to the record. A beautiful song, ends with the repetition of the line, "I feel like I'm sleeping and I can't wake up," hinting at some of the themes of subsequent records in a subtle way as well. And yeah, it's quite a muted and low-key affair, but I'm curious to hear what you all think of this record as a foundation, as a beginning for the Antlers.
Yeah, I liked it a fair bit. It is obviously one of the more restrained Antlers releases, but several of the things that would be the mark left by Antlers on the music landscape show up here, like the sort of the vocal stylings of the lead singer. It's kind of thing where I picture a lot of sort of emotional teenagers trying to practice the specific way he sings in his falsetto over and over again in their bedrooms, and then they start their own sort of indie bands, and you can just see that permeate out from there. I enjoyed track 4, Nashua, particularly. The vocals, they feel so delicate. And the song sounds like it could be, if it had fuller production, almost like a pop hit at points, if it wasn't just an acoustic song. I enjoy the lyric, "You need to cut me out because I'll only let you down. You deserve attention. I can't give you that." That's another sort of recurring idea that Antlers keep returning to as a sort of one-sided relationship. Obviously, there's sort of a use of sort of up and down guitar rhythm using the bottom strings alternating with the top strings of the guitar that gives it a real sense of driving melancholy. And really, the whole album is full of these hauntingly sparse, very evocative cuts that, while good, hint at better things to come, in my opinion.
I just wanted to follow up on something you said, lyrics that you alluded to in Nashua, about that are kind of quite self-deprecating and putting down of oneself and trying to so as to lift up someone who is ostensibly a partner. And obviously, I think what's great about these records, and we'll discuss from album to album, is there's a real emotional arc and a sense of aging and maturity through experience that you get with each album building from the next. And so there is a sense of real, genuine sort of self-loathing and self-deprecation on this record. And you'll see that recur on Hospice, especially in the context of a relationship. But there you get a sense of a more maturity, and in that record, the character grows to understand, to love and respect themselves, and not believe that they are deserving of the hurt that's inflicted on them. So it's like you see a nascent sort of early sign of that, of the situation that would lead to that. And also on Nashua, there's a lyric that references lacerations in your spine, which I think hints at is a deliberate kind of medical, biological allusion that is sort of a hint at the similar metaphor of physical illness or physical unwell that is going to be expanded more and more on Hospice as well.
The spinal imagery of both of those albums has always reminded me of the lyricism of the Neutral Milk Hotel album, In the Aeroplane Over the Sea, which uses a lot of repetitive imagery of that same sort of thing while talking about a similarly almost one-sided romantic affair that I think you guys are both speaking to. I don't know. There's so much folk that influence this and so much folk influenced by this that it's almost impossible to pick up any one of these albums and not sort of feel the reference points on either side of it temporally.
Yeah. I think there's also a musical comparison to be noted between the two records in the way in which you have both stripped back folk, but then like layers and layers of noise that the Antlers will explore on the albums to follow.
Which of course connects to what Tyler said, that the influence comes from Phil Elverum. Phil, who is very inspired by a lot of those Athens, Georgia, Elephant Six bands.
Yeah.
And the nature of the early part of that project is to capture on tape these sort of sounds of analog recording equipment. And that's really what drives the Antlers. And for me, especially in this early era, sets them apart from a lot of these other folk bands, because that's something that they're really trying to capture with their sound. It's a very bedroom recording, of course, but it's designed to be very textured and full of a lot of reverb and techniques that are common in the dream pop genre, which is something that, gets fleshed out, and those comparisons will come up later as we get into the last couple albums of their career, where, those feel of a part with a Beach House record to me in a lot of ways.
Right. Yeah, no, definitely. One thing I want to circle back to is, again, some of the lyrical content and themes on this record, specifically with regard to the title track, which I think is perhaps one of the most well written for one, and lyrically insightful songs on the record, specifically with regard to what I was talking about earlier with that theme of self-worth in a relationship that is abusive or toxic in some way. And specifically, Peter digs into metaphors of trees and roots, and references to lines like, trees are still trees if their roots are not deep. Pull up my roots, but I'm replanted. Lines like that. And so I'm curious what you all think is the significance of the imagery of the metaphor of trees and roots with regard to this record, and really the Peter's songwriting in general.
One thing that I think that I would say, when you're listening to this record, or to a certain extent the EPs that come after the next album, In the Attic of the Universe, and those are Cold War and New York Hospitals. All three of those releases, in some respects, to me, function as a proof of concept for Hospice. And that's not to diminish them or anything like that. I think that you can just see the seeds of these ideas that would eventually kind of blossom into this very celebrated project that would come later. But in particular, the imagery of the tree and the idea of roots and the idea of these kind of cycles, it reminds me, and it reminds me on that later project as well, it's one of the central metaphors to me, is that it reminds me of the myth of Sisyphus. Peter, as a songwriter, is describing a member of a relationship, and the other member of the relationship is that rock that he has to roll up that hill in the myth of Sisyphus, except he speaks about it like he's Orpheus and the rock is Eurydice, as if the rock falling down is something that he is accountable for and something that he will always hold himself accountable for. And so it's as if in both of those myths, it involves a character trying to, get to a certain place and failing to do that. And a lot of that failure is internalized. And that's sort of what I see to be the lyrical themes in a lot of the imagery, is relating to this idea that the person cannot let this task go undone. That no matter what the outcome, no matter how broad the scope of his failure, he must kind of continue to attack the problem over and over and over again, frequently in the same flawed way and to the same flawed ends.
I mean, there's a lot to be said about that, specifically in Hospice, which we'll get on to. But there's a track on that record that had the ultimate title, Sylvia Speaks, I think. It's one where Sharon Von Etten does a feature. And basically, and the idea is, this is how this character like imagines the other character thinks about them, where it's basically, I am falling, why can't you save me? And it seems like there's something that constantly is like torturing him in his music, even though Uprooted, the song to which you're referring, it is, for me at least, has more kind of hopeful imagery about replanting yourself, but at the same time the holes that are left by the roots that are uprooted are still there.
Okay, well, I think we should move on and just do our favorite tracks and a rating overall for this record. Jake, do you want to go first?
Sure. My three favorite songs are Flash Floods Don't Retreat, Uprooted, and I'm Hibernating. Least favorite song is Last Folk Song, and I would give it a 6.
My favorite tracks are probably Nashua, Seems Easy, and my favorite tracks are Nashua, Stone Thrower, and Uprooted. Least favorite track, I don't know, First Field. It's a very good record. I'm gonna give it a 7.
My three favorite tracks are Nashua, Uprooted, and I'm Hibernating. And I will give this a 6 out of 10.
Nice. What about you, Zach?
So I'll give a little bit of a final bow for this record. I think that one thing that's true about it is that it kind of works as a singular progression, like a suite, as opposed to a sequence of tracks. So like several albums I can think of, it's a little bit difficult to name tracks because it's sort of, they're the ones that pop off within the progression as being a really strong reprise or things of that nature. And I think the one thing that holds this together and keeps it interesting to me is that it almost feels like if I can use a cinematic term, like a formal experiment, even though it's thematically just kind of a seed. What holds it together is that when you're listening to it, it all coheses really well. I would say that my favorite 3 tracks are Uprooted, Keys, and Nashua. And if I can give it a half mark, I would give it a 6.5. And if I can't, I would give it a 6.
You can give half marks. What I just want to comment on that you said is I think that comment on the record being best enjoyed as a holistic thing rather than a series of tracks is even truer of the next record we're about to discuss.
Doubly so.
Yes, I was going to say, because that is my first thing to say about that record. It's my favorite thing about the record. So Uprooted, 6.4 out of 10.
When you consider how much the strengths of this band eventually become their production and you know the sort of density of their sound, I think that that's an impressive out of the gate project because what they're doing is so technical eventually that their most lo-fi projects still being that solid and that interesting really speaks to Silberman's talent, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. So and we have the second record released under the Antlers name following Uprooted quite quickly in March of 2007, also self-recorded and self-released, although I think it eventually did get a CD release under Full Records later that year. In the Attic of the Universe is the second record that we're going to be talking about today. And one thing I want to comment on is in many ways, it feels like these first two, it's been commented that it feels like these first 2 Antlers records as particularly Uprooted, are kind of, but I think both of them are kind of a building towards hospice quite clearly. Like there's an arc there. And I think how that manifests in these 2 records is that you have the exploration of the lyrical theme of hospice beginning in Uprooted, and you get in the Attic of the Universe has a slightly different and more introspective lyrical focus, but you get the development of the musicality that I think would be put to the fore on hospice happening here as well. So it's like Uprooted is the lyrical beginning, and in the Attic of the Universe is the actual sound of the Antlers blossoming into what would eventually explode with the grandiosity of hospice. And in many ways, this does feel musically like a dry run, a running up towards hospice. But that crucially shouldn't be taken as a way of diminishing the quality of this record. I think there is a case for In the Attic of the Universe as one of, if not the most holistic Antlers project that there is, in terms of existing as this single flowing piece of music that moves through various movements, feels almost dreamlike in the way that it broaches and brushes these various dynamically different sections against each other within and between songs. The way a very particular emotional tone is established and very subtly develops and builds throughout the record to this very kind of cathartic conclusion. Even though, as we've spoken about, Uprooted was a promising beginning, I think In the Attic of the Universe sees Peter moving in leaps and bounds ahead of that record in terms of structural coherency and thematic unity. I'm very curious to hear what you all think about this record in terms of how it builds from Uprooted and the experience of it, and what Peter is trying to do musically, and we can go into the lyrical subject matter in a bit as well.
Well, this is it's really jarring to just go from something as, like, again, not trying to demean the project here, but it's relatively, you have a project like Uprooted. It's just very, like, good indie project, good, solid, promising thing. And now that we dive into the real nitty gritty of their discography, where it starts being those more holistic things, it's really jarring to just sort of consider the leap that is taken from project to project here in the span of a year, not only delivering on the promise that the first record showed, but, like, somehow creating a level of promise in and of itself while still fulfilling the previous level of it. This was an album that I listened to on a complete whim. I'm pretty sure we had this episode, like, planned vaguely in, like, the rotation of this podcast's discography B-sides episodes. But I just sort of listened to it after I had listened to Hospice a couple of times. And I didn't know anything about this album. This album isn't even available to stream on Apple Music, so I actually had to track it down and then find it, which is odd. And it seems comparatively more lukewarmly received than their other records seem to be. Not really hard to see why when you look at this divorced from the context, I guess, of the band, and maybe if you're just not super into this as, like, kind of music as a whole, you sort of look at something like this as a very brisk singular sort of event, and then I can understand people listening to this album and kind of coming away with it thinking not thoughts that are too divorced from what a lot of us thought about the first record, that it's, like, good, it's more of a sweet, it shows promise but was fulfilled on later, but it is, if you've been paying attention to me or music that I like or talk about, it's nobody's surprise that this is my favorite Antlers record. In fact, I like maybe 9 records in all of existence more than I like In the Attic of the Universe. And trying to explain that is really hard because it's such an immediately viscerally emotional experience. But I have attempted to contain my thoughts on this project as being not even more than the sum of its parts, but something that I think is wholly transcendent, making usage of every single element of its construction to elevate itself beyond most musical projects I've heard in my life. The opening track starts, you sort of hear these footsteps on what sound like a gravel road, and slowly the kind of atmosphere begins to kick in. The fully formed sound here is immediately so much more of a step up from the last record, and it hits you instantly that this is going to be a more holistic sound for not just this album, but the band. The footsteps here have always made me feel like I'm walking down a road towards a cabin in the middle of a cold winter night. The gentle guitar strumming sort of comes in to kickstart a slowly building melody. The lyrics allude to the main character of this album in this narrative of the song being in the back of a car, being driven by somebody else, which is an important detail that hints at about what the album hints at thematically in terms of agency and the sort of idea of being taken somewhere, not by your own accord. The character also alludes to it being cold outside, which goes to show you how great the raw sound of all of this is, conveying its ideas in ways that are purely of a musical quality and not even necessarily a lyrical idea. It's just really good at implementing these images in your head without even using lyrics, which I find to be immensely impressive. The main character talks about preferring to sleep outdoors as though he were homeless or lost, but enters this house that he seemingly arrived at. The way the lyrics mention the setting of this album paint it as this weird combination of being this humble, lonely abode in the middle of nowhere, but also as some sort of strange intersection of like dimensional crossroads. As the album title sort of implies, there is this setting is just, it's described by details that you would assign to a normal home, but also combined with this sense of cosmic grandiosity. Upstairs and downstairs and outside on the roof, small stars and steel bars say ghosts up in the attic tell the truth, or one of the first lyrics on the record, hinting at some kind of personal significance to this place. Once the sort of distant pianos come into this track, it becomes so fucking beautiful. I'm basically in tears right then and there. The song sort of lets the music carry itself for a short segment to let you sort of wade in the sound of all of it before the final verse and final minute of the song just fucking demolishes you. Seeing as the song has been like slowly increasing in build and volume, on both an album level and a song by song basis, this record is a literal perfect structural marvel. The final verse gives us a hint about how arriving at this location has sort of altered this character's perspective on something. Standing on shingles at night, can't you see there's a reason? The plans aren't on the ground, they're high and hanging down. Well, once I remember the words, we can climb down from the rooftop. I swear that I heard it right here, invasively clear. The song then seamlessly transitions into Look, which is instantly more noisy, but still very sparse. And the drum beat kind of throbs behind this very gentle wall of noise. The shimmering electronic wave just kind of bursts through as this melody of the previous song lilts into the foreground of the track until it finally builds seamlessly to this explosion of euphoric noise in this song's final third. It feels like concentrated happiness. It's clarity in song form. It's like arriving here at this place alone has created some kind of heightened emotional state. It gives you a lull right at the end so it can transition into the beautiful On the Roof, which to me has always perfectly evoked its title, the feeling of sitting on top of a roof of the described location, gazing out into the stars at night. But there's something bigger here, something grander than that. The stars that you're staring at aren't in the sky. It feels like this is your own little rest stop on some cosmic subspace highway, and you're gazing into all of existence, which with this song as a backdrop. The lyrics here, stuck to a growing black balloon. My neighbors are slowly growing maroon. Don't throw away my broken telescope. Who has dragged you away? Who's that carrying the rope? Building off this sort of earlier hinted idea that would be developed later, at the idea of loss of control, a loss of agency, being stuck to something that's controlling you, or an unseen force that holds power over you. There's a gentle sort of low vocal harmonies in the back of this mix, which goes to show how like detailed the production of all of these albums start out as being. It's amidst these sort of dense layers of noisy sound, and it creates a soundscape that's just so dense and involving that I can't even truly compare it to anything save for other songs that this band has made. The crescendo in this song 2 minutes into it, that after like in the song just sort of builds to it with these like crashing cymbals is marvelous. It's like I'm watching a star explode right in front of me. I can't really express the overwhelming levels of cosmic dread I am imbued on by the immediate juxtaposition of the next track, which is Shush, where the eerie, skeletal, ghostly chimes delicately press into the soundscape and sort of echo out of existence. It's like watching distant planetary bodies and galaxies blink out of the sky and realizing that you're left alone with this like abyss of nothingness. However, in its second half, there's this warmth that swells in its dissonant, plucked strings that sort of twinkle around you as if you've somehow found solace in this emptiness, this loneliness. And I find that to be enrapturing as an experience. Music very rarely makes me feel genuine fear, but the sonic detour here, as well as how intimately that this is mixed, make for a deeply unsettling experience. It's so brief, and yet it feels like a journey, which is a perfect encapsulation as the album as a whole. It manages to encompass a full range of emotion and make me feel things that I scarcely encounter with just music alone. Like the lyrics are vital to feeling and understanding what the album has to offer in its totality, but so much of what makes Attic special to me is purely musical, and how the purely musical elements evoke something deep within me. It reaches into my brain and my heart, and it makes me feel an incredibly aching loneliness, but one that feels simultaneously comfortable and safe, allowing me a moment and an escape from everything in the world. It's something that's so vital about music that I love, for me anyway. And this goes into The Universe is Going to Catch You. It's a key point in the record, but it's also one of the songs I would say does work irrespective of the suite style structure of this record. You can sort of go back to this as a singular song more than the other ones, but this doesn't diminish its placement at all. The song gives you equal doses of feeling both lost and comforted, but almost like you're suspended in darkness, trying to like wait for whatever comes next, which thematically ties into the song's lyrics. The way this record manages to create thematic coherency between lyrics of some of the tracks and the pure sounds of others do nothing short of floor me. But here they're implemented to deliver something very vital. The urgent guitar chords break in, and the lyrics tell the story of the main character's frustration with their place in the universe. The chorus alludes to being told that the universe is going to catch you, a mantra that's continually repeated over and over. And on the final repetition in the chorus, it just sort of explodes with this blooming, distorted guitar line that makes you want to get up and dance. Frankly, there's a disconnect from the people the main character knows here that's sort of implied as the verses go on, implying that the title of the song is something that the main character is telling themselves or being told as a sort of excuse, a catch-all to justify anything and everything that's happening to them, mainly separation and loneliness, something to emptily reassure them that everything will be all right. It says, "Come back inside to this house, to your home, made of steel-structured styrofoam. Nobody's out there, but someone is singing you back to your birthplace. That voice is the same voice you heard on the same night that everything glowed, took you into the air, and the arms of the universe kept you from falling. But after that happened, those arms did not come back. So when you leapt up and nobody caught you, your neck broke." This leads into the Carrying Arms, which sort of starts with a reversed instrumental that still manages to swell despite being played backwards due to its ingenious multiple layers. While this is an instrumental, I think that the title of this and the reverse instrumental hint at something greater happening in the narrative of the album. Peter has said that this album is about his personal struggle with faith, religion, and finding his place in the universe. And The Carrying Arms seems to be bridging the gap between the songs that surround it in a very important way. The cover of this album shows a figure, a crude drawing of a man distinctly arms. And in the following track, the lyrical passage of the third verse begins with, "I woke up without arms." Seeing as this follows, "The universe is going to catch you," I think what's being implied here is that arms are sort of a metaphor for agency. Peter does this throughout the entire discography of using ideas of missing body parts, missing limbs to imply a more physical or emotional disconnect from something. He did it on the last album, as a matter of fact. It's sort of a metaphor for agency, control, and safety. The Universe is Going to Catch You is a song about being in denial. It's assuring yourself that everything will be all right in the end, no matter what, and that in the end, the universe itself will, in fact, cater to you. The universe, through the eyes of this main character, is just himself. He views himself as being powerful enough to catch himself. He views as though he doesn't have to worry. The Carrying Arms being a song that, like so many other moments on this record, weaves in to the thematic core of the lyrics with music. The reversed instrumental swell that follows The Universe Is Going to Catch You is a moment of realization. It is, as he has previously alluded to, a moment of clarity, gained by perspective of gazing into the beyond. It's a realization of how small you are and how everything will not be okay in the end. And this idea is reinforced by segueing into In the Snow. The line, I woke up without arms, alluding to the last songs like it was a dream, discovering that his arms, the things that will catch him, are gone, and having to confront the futility of existence and potentially the idea of that a greater force, himself, the universe, God, doesn't exist and won't save him. He talks about feeling as if the stars were inside him, but they screamed for release and tell him that this place he's in isn't one he can stay in for long. He can't simply lay back and accept futility, nor can he surrender to the idea that the universe will grant him solace. I couldn't walk in direction with all the static reflection. I was lost inside a map that I had written in a nap, hinted at the self-doubt that comes from all of this. He's pontificating on himself, the world, everything. I imagine just walking around this house that the narrative paints at night, emptily, thinking about all of these lofty ideas as they weigh on you, as I've done countless times in the last year. This brings us to, in my opinion, the shining moment of not only the album, but of the Antlers' entire career, the closing track, Stairs to the Attic. The build here, instrumentally and lyrically, is simply flawless. The main character says he's through with sitting still, and the song paints the image of walking to the attic of this house. But the journey up these stairs is not a linear one. It's a journey through this M.C. Escher painting of winding, spiring staircases with different beginnings and endings, full of possibility. The lyrics allude to capturing a childlike fascination with things like doors that do not have locks and stairways that are blocked, tapping into a part of himself that allows him to see the world in a new perspective. That being lost is, in fact, a way of seeing the many possibilities and paths that life holds, but not in a way where he fears it, in a way that he wants to explore it. And each step was far apart and far away from the steps before it, and the air was getting thinner until I couldn't breathe at all. And if I happened to look behind me, there were miles and miles of stairs, enough so I couldn't see the doorway, but I knew that it was there. And he talks about the door to the attic. It doesn't have old clothes, it doesn't have a ceiling. Everything had opened wide into the jaws of something bigger. And suddenly I saw that I was upstairs and outside and freezing on the roof, all of the places that he's been throughout this sort of record exploring this place. Finally, it found me, the answer, the feeling, and the truth, the final lines on the record, that I'm small, smaller than the smallest fireball. Instead of relying on blind faith or leaning on uncertainty itself, he uses this path and the steps that came before him as what he places his faith in, things that he, as stated, knows is there. He accepts insignificance and smallness. He enters the attic and looks out the window into the universe and finds that it isn't this thing that's going to swallow him or this thing that's going to save him, but is an unexplored ocean of cosmic possibility that is yet uncharted. The way this song reincorporates the lyrical themes of every single song before it, previous song melodies, and musical motifs is just perfect. It builds into being one of the most dense, gorgeous, explosive things I've ever heard, eclipsing even anything that came before it on this album. As someone who has struggled with this very lofty, often vague existential conflict, it gives me peace. It pacifies one of the most horrifying anxieties that somebody can struggle with. This album is an escape. It is my subspace getaway for when I need to breathe and take a moment and collect myself. This short album that is barely longer than an episode of network television sitcoms, even shorter than the first, but it is still somehow holistic And while I find myself comforted and terrified and totally in awe of it, I am never completely another swath in it. It does not ever allow me to hide myself. It's short enough to remind me that, like the main character of this record, I have a world that I have to return to. I cannot stay in this attic forever because I have a life to live. And while sadness and loneliness are things that this album touches on and speaks to me in a way that I find fairly profound, it is not that makes me value this record like I do. This is one of those albums that not only comforts me, but it makes me happy to be like alive, to experience so much in my tiny little life. And it makes me grateful to all the things that make it worth sticking around for. Many times on this podcast, most notably with Frightened Rabbit or The Twilight Sad, I've indulged in a personal narrative that connects me to music very deeply, but here I find no need to do so, as the music itself is simply so powerful and human that it doesn't matter. And I'm just glad that something can affect me as deeply as something like Painting of a Panic Attack or Forget the Night Ahead. But instead of touching solely on painful memories and experiences, I get the entire spectrum of the human experience as I know it. And doing all of that in 27 minutes is nothing short of a goddamned miracle. I love this album more than most things in general, and genuinely cannot put into words, like, even after all that I've said, doesn't do 50% of how I appreciate this shit. I turn this on, I go driving in the middle of the night, and it clears my head, and for that I'm grateful for it. It is an integral piece of my musical identity at this point, and I love it.
Yes. First of all,
Yeah.
I gotta do the Undersea album justice. That's my fucking goal on every B-Sides episode, is to love the album that nobody else in the world gives a shit about.
Well, you say that. It's also my favorite Antlers record.
Let's fucking go!
It's strange because we compare this to Frightened Rabbit so much, and The Midnight Organ Fight is my favorite Frightened Rabbit album. Dealing with a few of the same questions and musical ideas, certainly. But I'll try to be brief because you've already touched on so much of what I wanted to say. Not that I'm complaining, because you did it better than I would have done.
Try.
But I'll just talk a little bit about my sort of emotional journey with this record. I listened to this after Hospice, which when I listened to it, I was like, this is just like the most my shit thing I've ever heard. And then I sat down and listened to this, and it's much shorter. I think it's about half the length. And it was just slowly building and building. And by the end, I was in floods of tears. And I immediately messaged Jake, just like, tell me I'm not the only one, please. Like, but no, the fact is, this is a journey to a sucker punch of a closing song. And I feel like everything else exists to lead you into why that song resonates so much. It's like setting up a deck of cards, and then the final song is just putting the two cards on the top, and now it's perfect. And everything else supports it. For me, the album feels like a tug of war between returning to a nostalgic but maybe uncomfortable past and moving forward. That those feel like the two ideas that war against each other in this record. And you know, it gives its day in court to both sides of that debate, I suppose.
Love Phoebe Bridgers' Punisher.
You sort of feel like that it explores the idea that maybe in going back, you can reconcile some of your trauma, you can get closure maybe, or it's just comfortable to go back to what you know, but it is evidently a traumatic past. And when the final track hits, I started crying immediately just because of the way the guitar was being played, in the way that constant down strumming on the guitar in a repetitive, monotonous rhythm. It makes you feel like you're being propelled forward, and like that is an inevitability. It then just instills in you the freeing, liberating joy of leaving your baggage behind, if such a thing is possible. And that's just through the way of playing a guitar on the closing track of the record. And then the lyrics start. The imagery is beautiful. I love the line Jake's already touched on. looking back and not being able to see the door, but knowing it's there. Because that to me perfectly captures sort of the mental state of doing the work of moving forward. And as I've said before, it is work, and it's an idea that's explored a lot in the Antlers discography.
Sergi made reference to this record feeling like a reckoning with the past and a moving forward. But to me, the first two Antlers records, my experience listening to them is that they are, and I guess this is not different to what you're saying, but they're mired in a present trauma, in being stuck within something that you can't even fully appreciate how damaging it is as it's happening to you, and you're retreating and you're frantically trying to make sense of it and to understand your place and to understand why you're feeling the way that you're feeling. And this is part of the thematic arc that I think reaches a breakthrough with Hospice, where this record is ostensibly about, not quite about the same sort of specific thing as Hospice, but it's about a very similar sort of emotional state, very similar sort of being powerless. And there's also a sense of finding comfort in your insignificance in this record. And that's very much, I think, what the cathartic climax of Stairs at the Attic really gets at. If you find comfort in your insignificance, then the parts of your life where you are important and people are drawing from you or using you or expecting you to do something become these inflicted traumas. And that's, I think, how the record kind of ties back to the relationship dynamic stuff that's touched on in Uprooted and is fleshed out more in Hospice. Anyway,
there we go.
Well, we've spoken a lot about this record, but we haven't heard from Zach yet. So I'm curious, Zach, on what your perspective is with this album, where you think it fits into this broader career arc, and how you think it relates to the records either side of it.
So after so much detail has been spoken about the record, I'm going to give the most airheaded answer imaginable, which is that this is the Antlers record that is the best one to put on in your car, driving down the road with the windows open on a spring day, shouting every single lyric at the top of your lungs. And I think that actually speaks very much to the thematic value that both Saoirse and Jake really teased out. If Uprooted is the seed of the Antlers, this is an early recontextualization. That album, to me, that being Uprooted, very much speaks to a lot of the themes that exist on Hospice and that exist on Burst Apart. Whereas In the Attic of the Universe is cathartic in a way that those two records, Hospice and Burst Apart, are, but Only Familiars is really oriented around. And I think that that's a really interesting thing that presents itself musically. Jake has correctly used the word holistic to describe this album, although it is a word that I would use to describe almost every Antlers album. They are very cinematic in their ability to wrap an album around a concept, both sonically and narratively. And of course, that's how it's codified to me as somebody who entered with Hospice, which is so conceptually driven. But every one of their projects, particularly up to Burst Apart, are really bound around singular ideas, and they're based on progression and they're based on reprise. But the difference between this album and maybe Hospice or Uprooted is that those have an emotional tenor that's pretty, I'm going to use this word and I don't mean it negatively, homogenous. Whereas this is very bright. If I could use a goofy metaphor, it's like those are casseroles, this is a salad. It's got so much texture and kind of bright variant flavor to it that when you get to the final track, which is what this entire album builds to, Stairs to the Attic, it begins with the progression that is on Nashua. And I won't give it away until I talk about Hospice, where it reincorporates itself on that record. Mm-hmm. But it's a very slow, almost lullaby-esque melody with a single acoustic guitar that explodes into, a bright, shimmering guitar riff that you've heard before. It's a reincorporation, and it really speaks to the sequencing of this record, which is one of the great strengths of this band, that they've given you all these elements over the course of the record, and they incorporate them into what I would tell you is like a dazzling fireworks display at the end of the album that just makes the entire experience so rewarding. It doesn't necessarily speak to my exact emotional proclivities in the way later Antlers projects will. But gosh, it just comes together so well musically and so well emotionally. And it's like a tonic to their own work in so many ways. I think that Saoirse really spoke to that Sisyphus metaphor, where it's like this album is about absolution, forgiveness, and acceptance in a way that the next couple of albums are also about. But those are things that those narrators of those albums, it feels more elusive for. Whereas here, there is a wholehearted embrace of that kind of optimism at the end of it. And it's just a really great musical experience. I've really enjoyed revisiting it for the purpose of talking about this, because it's an album that I've just, I had to come back to it, just as I did with Uprooted. And like a lot of people across the internet, I was a bit more mild on it. And it's something that's taken me some time to fully not come around on. I've always liked it. I've always enjoyed it, but it's something that I had to come around on as having the same level of written strength, songwriting strength, lyrical strength, and all those things. But I've always appreciated the musical variety of it. And to this day, that really remains like what makes it feel so special to me.
Yes.
I think
it feels vindicating.
Okay, well, again, it seems a bit maybe counterintuitive or reductive to list favorite tracks on a record that is, again, so holistically about, we maybe are drawn towards the movements of it that are more loud and that represent those cathartic explosions, but really they are meaningless without the connective tissue of the record. So, I mean, we can give favorite tracks with that caveat. And we'll do a reverse order since we like to alternate our order. So Zach can go first this time if you want, Zach.
Sure. These are not in order of whenever I want to say this for the record. I'll always give you 3 tracks, but they're not ranked necessarily. I'll probably always give.
We don't necessarily do that either. Don't worry.
Perfect. So my 3 favorites are "Look," which is a little piano interlude that is the second track of this song that I just find to be sumptuous and beautiful, even at a short runtime of under 2 minutes. "The Universe is to Catch You," which is, I maintain, the most fun Antlers song to belt aloud to. And of course, "Stairs in the Attic," which is the climactic finisher of this record. And I would say, at a bare minimum, a top 5 Antlers song all time.
Hell yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
My score for this record would be an 8 out of 10.
My 3 favorite tracks are, or 3 favorite sections are "In the Attic," "The Universe is Going to Catch You," and "Stairs to the Attic." Very kind of basic picks because they represent, I think, like more than half of the album's runtime, but they just are fantastic musical exercises. God, they made it sound so academic. They're just.
Do you know what it reminds me of, Tyler? Is the artwork, where if you ask someone's 3 favorite tracks, they're going to say "Rain Array," they're going to say "Vitriol," they're going to say "Quetzalcoatl." I mean, you might have some variants, but with an album that's so built around a progression that way, there's just these notes that are like kind of undeniable.
Yeah. Anyway, my rating for this record is a hearty 9 out of 10.
Oh, fuck yes. The good shit. That's what it feels like. No, my favorite tracks are very basic again. "In the Attic," "The Universe is Going to Catch You," and "Stairs to the Attic." I'm going to give this record a 10 out of 10.
Delightful.
Funny, we talked about the inherent sort of meaninglessness of picking 3 favorite tracks, because technically I have not available for both favorite and least favorite tracks. But if you wanted me to pick my 3 moments on the album that I like the most, I'm going to give a shout out to "Shish." That I love. I love "In the Snow" and the peerless "Stairs to the Attic," and this is the 10iest 10 that ever did 10.
Yeah, good shout out for "Shush," because I always thought that was just kind of like this weird interlude thing. But when I sat down to listen to this album in pitch black darkness last night, that track,
As you should.
yeah, exactly. Yes. That track, it was like it was triggering an out of body experience somehow. Like there was something so tactile and physical about it, even though it's very minimal. And the way when it kind of blossomed towards the end, I thought that the next track had started. But that's again part of the way that this album kind of bleeds together between its track boundaries so well. But yeah, good song.
So many tracks run into each other. But I just want to say this because this is fucking perfect in my opinion, right? That this is 9.3 average. The 3 records are Bedlam and Goliath, Pedestrian Verse, and Goodness.
I mean, yes.
Yeah.
I mean,
very,
yes.
Very
so true.
So true, James and T podcast.
Company. Yeah.
Kings, queens, all.
This is basically like what this record is to Jake is what Goodness is to me. So
yes, exactly.
That's exactly deserving. So,
and they're both 10 out of 10 records. So,
I agree. So before we get to the next and of course hotly anticipated studio album release, Zach's already alluded to some EPs that are worth mentioning. Not necessarily worth dwelling on, although Zach, if you want to speak about them, then that's fine. But more in a sense that they are building towards Hospice. They are emotionally and tonally representing a shift in the discography, and reincorporating some of the stuff from their first 2 records into a new, a similar but more distinct direction. And a lot of these songs are covers. I think New York Hospitals in particular has covers of the Magnetic Fields' Nothing Matters When We're Dancing from 69 Love Songs, and the Yo La Tengo song Tears Are in Your Eyes. But this EP also has a song called Sylvia, an Introduction on it, which if you have the deluxe edition of Hospice is a bonus track on that record. And obviously is the most explicit hint sort of or presage to what was what's about to happen with Hospice. Zach, did you have anything you wanted to say about either of these EPs?
That if I were structuring this as if a documentary, I would actually, if it were about me and my experience with the band, the first album that I would cover is Hospice, and then I would come back to these because they are contextualizing material in a lot of ways. Right. Both, as you say, the album New York Hospitals, just as the name might evoke, if you've already heard Hospice, is circulating around some of the same thematic ideas. It does have 2 covers and that alternate version of Sylvia, and so I think it's really valuable as a contextualizing piece of Hospice. I would probably look upon that in the same way that Jake kind of describes Uprooted, where it's inessential, but particularly when and we'll get farther into this with Hospice. I was in on that record very, very early, and so there was a need to sort of go back and get every piece of the puzzle. And if you feel that when you listen to this band, that's what these 2 releases are for. The other thing that's worth shouting out on the Cold War EP, which has 2 original tracks, East River, Berlin Wall, and Cold War, both of which are quite good. There's also a cover of the Beach House song Apple Orchard. Yes. And that's really from their self-titled record. And I think that's really, really important for the beyond Hospice trajectory. I've already made this comparison once, but by the time we get outside of Hospice, this goes from a lo-fi indie folk project to a full-fledged dream pop project in a lot of ways. And that little grain of influence is part of that arc. And so it's really interesting to hear this band that would go on to make Burst Apart, that would go on to make Undersea, that would go on to make Familiars, quoting this band that really was for dream pop in this same era what the Antlers were to indie folk. Because of course at this time, Beach House, at the same time that they're releasing all these records between 2005 and 2009, that's when Beach House is out there dropping their self-titled record. That's when they're dropping Devotion, Teen Dream, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. And so they're just these 2 totems of like not underground exactly, but kind of under the radar, not early Pitchfork. See, it's sort of this transition phase where indie and Pitchfork kind of became the the nom du jour in the early 2010s. And it's really kind of cool to study the history of that. So if you really get into the way that all these pieces flow together as a progression, I think that they're two really interesting releases to get your hands on. But I would not consider them to be essentials for getting into the band. It's deep for fans only type stuff, for the real ones.
Could you correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't this sort of the time where band members were added, per se?
I'm about to get to that. Following these two EPs, we get, there's a protracted development for this next record. So writing and recording begins in 2007 and continues throughout 2008. And Hospice, the Antlers' third album, is not released initially until March of 2009, but then is remastered and reissued in August of 2009 by French Kiss Records. And I believe, I didn't experience this in real time, but I believe that was around the time when this band started blowing up. I wish I had gone back now and looked at the date of the Pitchfork review. It looks like it's July 1st, so before this reissue. So fair to say that the Pitchfork Best New Music probably contributed pretty heavily to the groundswell that led to this record getting a proper label release and then everything that followed. And if you think it's facile of me to be focusing so much on Pitchfork, it really is an important and part of this narrative of this band, whether we like it or not, because of the influence that they had, and that particular, as figureheads of a particular scene of a particular world of indie music, in terms of cultivating and determining the sound of indie, basically, and they deemed the Antlers worthy, and so they're basically probably the reason we're here discussing them today, strangely enough. Anyway, Hospice comes out in 2009, and yes, Saoirse, you're right to point out that there are additional personnel on this record. So you have Peter Silberman, again, still the front man and figurehead of the band, obviously writing all the songs, singing all the songs, with vocal additions from Sharon Van Etten on certain tracks, who also incidentally was kind of blowing up in a smaller but still significant way thanks to Pitchfork and her early records, which actually also, now that I think about it, have a very similar emotional tone to this record, because a lot of Sharon's early records are about her experiences in abusive relationships and processing personal responsibility and things like that, and a sense of self, a lost sense of self. But anyway, that's a discussion for another day. But you also have Darby Sicci. I'm terrible at pronunciation. But Darby Sicci is playing trumpet and bowed banjo, and Michael Lerner is on percussion on this record, and they would of course go on to be permanent members of the Antlers for the next two studio records. I'll open the floor here. What I'm curious about, in fact, maybe it would be appropriate for Zach to speak first on this, considering that Zach was kind of on the ground floor with this record, and probably can give us some better and more coherent insights than I can into what this record is about and what the significance of it is.
I would love to do that. I think that, first of all, you demurred a little bit, but I completely agree with you that the vitality of understanding how Pitchfork plays into the history of this album, and to not the genesis of internet music culture by any means, but the ballooning of internet music culture into the point where Pitchfork, Anthony Fantano, at that time, although I don't know that it's necessarily true anymore, the 4chan board Mew, all kind of bleed into this internet culture that absolutely is the foundation for Twitter music culture, and in many respects the reason that the four of us are friends. Obviously there are other reasons for that coming together, but it's such an important time for the development of this culture. You have to consider that within a few years you're getting Merriweather Post Pavilion, the XX, Hospice, My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, Kendrick Lamar's Good Kid, Mad City, Fiona Apple's The Idler Wheel. For a 4 to 5 year stretch here between 2008 and about like 2012, 2013, there and of course there's music before and after that, but there is this explosion of records, and all of them would make for interesting discussions like this because of how important they ended up being in terms of citing the works of the past and influencing the works of the future. And Hospice was this major watershed moment. And in many corners of like the indie internet, it's considered to be like as essential as some kind of blue would be for jazz fans. It is considered in a lot of circles to be exactly that essential. One of the things that I actually missed in saying all that was one of my favorite records, Car Seat Headrest's Twin Fantasy, the 2011 release. So just to give kind of that flavor of like exactly what's going on, and some of that's Pitchfork, some of it's going to be, you know, this record, just like My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy and the 2020 Fiona album record, Fetch the Bolt Cutters, was a famously kind of Anthony Fantano was kind of mild on it, but Pitchfork is really high on it. And those things mattered. People discussed that, and they really informed people's interest in music and in talking about it and in forming group discussions over it. And I don't think the importance of that could possibly be overstated. All of that's kind of ancillary to the music itself, but I think, you know, when you're doing a discography discussion about the context of a band, it's so important to understand the context of the music. And with that, I'll say that here's a great anecdote for you. So the first time I ever listened to this album, I had downloaded it. I had put it onto my iPod Classic, which was an 80 gig iPod. I was 17 years old. I was about to turn 18. I had graduated high school. And I put this album on as I was driving to, no kidding, a Hollywood video. I'm just dating myself and everything else about this story. And I realized as I was going there, this was not the sort of album that I should be, as I just said the opposite about with In the Attic of the Universe, listening to in my car. This is not the environment for this. I need headphones and some space to think about how, you know, evocative and heavy these themes are. And so I go into, I stop playing the music. I go into the video store and I buy 3 movies. The first 2 are irrelevant. Watchmen, the Zack Snyder film. It's kind of topical now, I guess. Ryan Johnson's The Brothers Bloom. And the third movie that I bought was Charlie Kaufman's debut film, Synecdoche, New York.
Oh, God, down horrendously. Oh, no.
So I go home and I watch Synecdoche, New York.
Oh, God.
And I finished that film. And would you like to know what I did right after I did that? I listened to the Antlers Hospice.
Can you see the look of horror
Down
on
horrendously.
my face?
So I would just like the room to understand that the very first time that I listened to this album in full, I was, you know, my armor had been sundered and my chest cavity opened, and then Pete Silberman, Darby, and the whole crew just reached in and Kali Ma'd my heart. Just ripped it out, ate it, the whole bit. So that's the context for me, personally. No, as somebody who really does, I would say, have a literary and cinematic background primarily, even over music. The conceptual nature of this album, as Tyler said, the cohesiveness of it, which we've talked about with the past records, where the through line of this album is narrative in a way that a lot of other albums are not. It has characters, it has a plot, it has structure. It's a concept album in full. And one of the things that I cited earlier, the reason I felt the need to cite it, My Beautiful Dark Twisted, or not My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, excuse me, but Car Seat Headrest's Twin Fantasy, is because those are 2 albums that over the next couple of years, I would listen to a lot in tandem with each other, because they both shared that quality of being quite narrative and very visual and allegorical in the way that a novel or a film is visual and metaphorical. And one of the other albums that I mentioned on the Pitchfork side of things in terms of this era is Good Kid, Mad City, which I think is the same thing. And these were all things that, for me, as an outsider to music, like not as an outsider, I always listen to music, but as somebody that was kind of an outsider to the independent music scene and like really following it in the way that you guys on your podcast follow it, I engaged with music in a different way and was drawn into the medium through these very narrative projects that were heavy on metaphor, that were structured in a way that my more narratively and story-oriented brain could really grapple onto. And in the same way that I think that Jake and Saoirse and all of us really are enamored by In the Attic of the Universe's economy, the way that it is utilitarian and uses all of its pieces to build to a singular point, that is the exact appeal of Hospice to me. It is a narrative story. And I haven't even begun to talk about the specific pathos of the story being not simply sad in the way that some people dismiss it. Let's dig a bit into what the album is. It is an allegorical story about a couple of partners in a romantic relationship on one end of it. It is an abusive, toxic, and demanding relationship. It was maybe the first album that I had ever heard that so directly and honestly spoke to me about not only things that I had experienced in relationships, but things that I had seen in other people's relationships. And on the other side of it, as I said, it's allegorical. The other side of it is the story of a hospice worker, from which the album takes its title, and a patient who is dying of an inoperable bone cancer and is going to die. And earlier, we've referenced the myth of Sisyphus. That is very much what the narrative thrust of this album is. It is about how, on one hand, this relationship, which is toxic and unhealthy, is unsalvageable. And on the other hand, this disease is incurable. And it's an album about, in many ways, coming to accept, after a long time of struggling to accept, that inevitability. And what I think speaks to me so much about this album after so long is that there is a genuine human truth to the fact that we, as people, when it means something to us, and this can be positive or negative, will stand and let ourselves take on the unbearable emotional weight of tragedy because it means something to us to know that we accepted that in the moment. That is the theme of one of my favorite movies of the 2010s, Arrival. It is the theme of several of my favorite books. This idea that you know that what's coming is going to hurt, and yet you allow yourself to be hurt anyway. And I think that this album has many different directions that it takes you in with that idea of the person who can't lift the boulder up the hill but is going to try. I think that there is honor in it, and then obviously it in many ways is an album that people remember as being very sad and very dour because it does not balk at the idea that this is indeed a self-destructive behavior, and that while it may be universally experienced, or not universally but close to it, it is something that is hurtful and ultimately must be moved on from. So many of the album's ideas are about, retreating into oneself, which is so fundamentally at odds with the idea of what a relationship is meant to be. It's meant to be two people being in one another's presence and sharing themselves with each other for better and worse. Whereas this album is about forcing yourself to be there for something that harms you, while also retreating into yourself so as not to be a burden to anybody. And so I think in many ways throughout each of the songs, it's demonstrating something that is common, and it's showing the work as to how it gets there. And being able to explore it in such a narrative way is what makes it such, I imagine as we get to talking about it, we will end up speaking on certain tracks and certain moments that are really evocative. But it is that story and understanding how all the details fit together that I think makes it such a rewarding experience that allows you to kind of deepen the emotions. It's the details bring you into the feeling, bring you into the details. And that's the way that film works. That's the way that novels work. And that's why kind of speaking about it on such like a broad top to bottom conceptual level, I think is really important, because that's how it's constructed, and that's how it works. There aren't I don't want to say that there aren't a lot of albums like that. There are many, many, many albums like that, but it's not necessarily the most common practice. But for as holistic as the last couple Antlers albums are, this is the first one where you look at it and you understand that they have been building to this idea from a beginning to an end with a climax. So much so that the album has tracks called Prologue and Epilogue. It is very much meant to be sort of understood as a narrative story. On a track by track basis. So many of these songs are just embedded into memory in the way that your favorite songs of all time really are. After opening with the very sort of gentle prologue, you get right into Kettering, which is my personal favorite Antler song. Spoilers. Which begins to start, kind of explaining the central metaphor of, this person who feels strung up waiting in a hallway for their patient, in the same way that this person feels strung up in this relationship, hoping to make things better, hoping to kind of find the light at the end of the tunnel. And as you progress on into Sylvia, which is a reference to the famous poetess and novelist Sylvia Plath, who committed suicide. So we're working in more narrative elements and narrative illusion to kind of deepen these ideas of self-destruction, the self-destructive habits, and ultimately the idea of self-annihilation. The song Bear is probably the most renowned song on the album, ? I don't actually know that. It just feels like the one that's most prone to being, as Saoirse was said about Nashua earlier, a pop banger. This is the first of two songs on this album that shares that chord progression with Stairs to the Attic and Nashua. And it has the middle segment where it's we're not oh, and it's the first time on the album where it's sort of broken out of what I've always found to be a kind of monochromatic, slow, somber tone, and it kind of breaks into these motifs that are a little bit bright and airy, while the subject matter is the story of a young woman getting an abortion, which in many ways kind of speaks to what may be the central conflict of one half of this narrative, that is the relationship half of this narrative. And then you go into 13, which is another sort of, very, it's defined by its production. The song 13 sonically is going to sound a lot like what we'll hear on Burst Apart and on Familiars, where it's just so layered and dense, and it takes you into this texture. It's really kind of a palate cleanser after the narrative heft of Bear. 2 is another one of my very favorite songs on this album. I think it's one of the best lyrical Antlers songs. The use of wordplay, duality, repetition, all these different things that kind of speak to the themes. It's the track that is the most compelling to me, that really teases out the relationship half of this narrative as opposed to the sort of hospital medical half of the narrative. And it's a song whose lyrics stay pretty embedded in my mind because they speak to so many experiences I've had. In particular, one lyric that I think really stands out to me about 2 is the moment in the song where he's sort of listing a number of things, that he talks about having 2 silver rings on our fingers in a hurry, and this idea that so much of what happens here, the conflict, is about being young and chasing after something that you feel is beautiful without understanding that Sisyphusian task that a relationship can be, for better or for worse. Shiva, another beautiful song. This is probably my favorite. Kettering is my favorite on the more medical side of it, but this is another a great song on this side of the allegory, with some very moving imagery about hair growing out and the sensation of this bone cancer, from which the woman in the story is suffering, being the sensation being scissors and too much to scream. So instead I just started to laugh. And it's just this deeply upsetting and evocative sort of imagery that leads into the powerfully cathartic Wake, which is a song where you kind of pull back the curtain and you sort of understand that these two concepts that the narrator is wrestling with represent, of course, the very same ideas. And in Wake, the narrator has very much receded into themselves, but is having to come to the conclusion that they must sort of open up and throw off the shackles of their guilt and things of this nature. And I think one of the most powerful conceits on the album is that is then followed by Epilogue, which shares the progression with Bear, Nashua, and Stairs to the Attic, and represents sort of what could be seen as dour ending, because I think it sort of reflects this idea that even once you have made the correct decision for yourself to move on, to act from your own self-benefit, self-care, as people on Twitter might call it, you're still not free of your memories. You're still not free of your experiences. And I think the reason that ending so clearly works for me is because it's very honest, and it speaks to what overall about Hospice is so moving, is that even though it is largely a negative emotional tenor, it speaks so keenly and so insightfully as to the human emotional experience, and the fact that often living a good life is not avoiding bad things or overcoming them, but finding a way to accept them and yourself simultaneously. And I think it's a record that understands that that's a very, very, very difficult thing to do. And it's very empathetic towards its narrator. It is very empathetic towards the love interest / patient in the story, even though frequently the relationship between them is portrayed to be toxic. Neither of them ever feels particularly villainous. They merely feel human. They merely feel flawed. And there's just so much honesty to that, and so much incisiveness, that, as I said, I was 17 when I first heard it, and it could not have been more compelling to me as an idea. It could not have solidified my love of the band any further than it did, and they would only go on to make music that I basically liked more than this, which is pretty impressive. So yeah, that's kind of my long-winded spiel on this album and my kind of analysis on it.
Zach, you've basically nailed every element of what makes this album so wonderfully layered and complex and interesting. One thing I want to draw attention to is the way in which structurally and in terms of just album cohesion and structure, this feels very much like an expansion of and a building upon In the Attic of the Universe. In a sense, again, I think I said when we reviewed that record really felt like a dry run for this. It was more modest in sound. It was more modest in subject matter, again, being a much more introspective and comparatively singularly focused record, whereas this is much more expansive in sound, much more dense in lyrical subject matter and the implications of the things that Peter is singing about, and the emotional nuance that Peter understands is crucial to getting across the human truth of the experience that is being written about. So, but again, it's also like a record where, again, there are definitely these sweeping, huge moments across the runtime where the album's sound balloons, but still it feels very much like this singular piece with various movements. But again, I see some people giving quite facile reviews of this where they say like, oh, the tunefulness of a song like Beer is great, but why do we need to have like the 7 minutes of Atrophy just being like random sounds and stuff? And it's just a failure to appreciate
terrible fucking take.
Failure to appreciate the ebb and flow of the sound of this thing.
It's like watching a Malik film and asking why the shot of the wheat field wasn't more directly connected to the plot. You must understand that like there is an objective, and I think that we've said this for all 3 records so far. There is an objective narratively that they accomplish musically, and not just in the written word, which is so much the defining feature of the early part of this band is their lyricism. The defining feature of the later part of the band is their production, and here. For these records here in the middle, I find that all 3 of them are firing on both sides really, really, really strongly. It's a really, really strong lyrical album, and those interludes I think are so vital to creating the sort of emotional context for how you assess those ideas and the way that those breaks in Bear kind of make you feel is kind of based on that.
And also one way in which this is a development from In the Attic is where that record is obviously very thematically consistent. It's less necessarily linear in its progression. There's definitely like a start and an end point and a climax and that sort of thing. But Hospice is much more explicitly linear in the story that it tells. It ebbs and flows in certain sections, but you get a sense of progression in both the metaphorical narrative and the real emotional story from one song to the next, such that, you know, when you get to a point in the record like Shiva, it's very clear that that is representing the end of something, literally death. And then Wake is I mean, Shiva and Wake, those titles are both funeral references. So you get a real sense of not just a thematic arc, but a real genuine narrative arc, which I think is one of the things that makes this record so immediately compelling and probably sucks a lot of people in. I don't have too much more really to add that Zach hasn't already said, but Jake, I'm curious about where you came at this record from, because I know I think this was the first Antlers you heard, right?
Yes and no, because the first thing I heard from them was their Undersea EP, because you recommended that to me when I needed some calming music. So that was technically my first exposure to them, but I actually didn't really put together in my head that it was the same people until later. So I guess this is my first proper Antlers experience. And
I slip in here for just a second. Before I lose this thought, Shiva, the many-armed Hindu goddess of death, which in American culture is probably most known from the Oppenheimer quote, where he speaks about the Manhattan Project and the invention of the atomic bomb, and saying, "I have become death, the destroyer of worlds." So the metaphors on this album a little extra.
The thing about this record is, again, in tandem with the allegorical nature of it, is that what makes it such a masterful work is that you can read almost every element of it in multiple different ways that are related but different, and get a meaningful conclusion or a meaningful takeaway from that reading. So even if you don't want to read this explicit abusive relationship narrative, you can read it in a more ephemeral way if you want to. So I think the titles are reflective of that as well. And they do a similar thing on Familiars, where the titles are just these one-word titles that evoke an image or evoke a sensation that you can obviously add your own experiences or your own interpretations to, but are really meant to set a mood rather than suggest a specific story.
In the same way that Wake is both a funeral image, but it is also literally like wake out of bed, right?
Waking
As if
up,
to rise.
Yeah.
And sorry, Jake. There wasn't a
point to
clean
make.
point. There wasn't a clean point when Tyler was talking about song titles before you started, and I really think that's one of the cooler things about this particular project. It's like I didn't know what Kettering meant when I listened to this. I had to look it up.
So that means that this was my first proper Antlers experience, I guess, with the context that they were the band that they were. And like Zach, I pretty much experienced this in the most painful way humanly possible. To glaze over a point that longtime viewers will certainly know by now, because I have managed to bring it up quite often, just because half of all music is about fucking, and the other half of music is about being sad about not fucking someone. But in late 2019, I was involved in a 5-month-long, horrifically toxic, abusive relationship that nearly killed me. And I spent the entire following year trying to bounce back from that. And it was insanely difficult because it was the most difficult point in my life. And as a result, lots of things that I used to love and things that I experienced for the first time were inevitably contextualized by my experience with that, and made a lot of things hit in a way that they didn't used to, or just hit in a way that, you know, maybe I couldn't properly appreciate until I had that particular life experience. And I didn't really know anything about hospice. I didn't really know anything about Antlers, in fact. But when I saw that the title was Hospice, when I saw the cover and I knew that it was sad, people thought that it was a sad album, and that's basically the only thing I knew about it. And I get the impression, I was just like, oh, this is going to be sad because this is going to be about a guy or somebody caring for somebody who's dying in hospice, and that's a sad thing. So yeah, of course that's gonna like ruin me. What I did not know is that it was in fact what Tyler and Zach have been referring to, is that it was in fact a dual metaphor for an abusive relationship. I did not know this. Under the circumstances under which I first listened to it, I had a horrifically long work week. I was basically blackout day drunk because I had been inhaling bourbon. I was tired, I was sad, and I was like, I need to take this moment that I have to stew in my own misery. And I was like, fuck it, why not? Tyler mentioned this album to me in a conversation, and I'll listen to it. And so I sat right where I am right now, listening to it, blinds shut, basically in complete and utter darkness, sitting there sipping my drink, gradually and slowly realizing the album was indeed about what it was about. And yeah, that makes this record very difficult to talk about, in the same way that records like Punisher are very difficult to talk about. But I do definitely feel a whole lot better about discussing this album, because Zach and Tyler have put the ways, and it like, not that you glazed over why it's like emotionally potent and emotionally poignant. You put that very, very well, but you also explained why the music itself and the more just basic construction of the album on like a purely artistic in and of itself level is good, impressive, adds to what it is going for in terms of its ambition, in terms of its narrative. All of that makes me feel better, because it's an album that I still like, no matter how much I write about it, no matter how much I think about it, talk about it, listen to it, I'm never going to feel fully equipped to unpack all of it, being who I am. Even without that experience, I feel like Hospice is an album that anybody would struggle to truly pick apart, just because of that poignancy. But I have a couple things that I hope are worthwhile to mention about it. And not to mention, I will say that like, it may be the most miserable I've ever been listening to a record, just with that combination of things. So you would think that this be an album that I like I was just like, I'm never going to listen to this shit again. And what surprised me is that every couple of weeks following my first listen, I managed to find a moment where I was like, I need to listen to Hospice again, because it slowly became a bit less poignant and painful, and became a bit more validating, I suppose. It helped me with the progression of realizing all of these things about it. And I think that something that is super important about what you two said is that the two main characters are both deeply human. Neither one of them is painted at being solely at fault. Both of them have real struggles that you can identify with, no matter where you are, who you are, what your experiences are. And that sort of that lack of, you could be very one-sided in this, and that sort of specific emotional nuance makes this a very, very powerful experience. And it's sort of grown with me in that way. I think that I've realized it's not a completely one-sided affair. I think the prologue is a pretty incredible tone setter. It's showing you in every possible way the way the Antlers had grown up to that point. It's sparse, it's noisy, it's intimate, and incredibly tragic sounding. That's again a leftover from In the Attic of the Universe for me, is that this is just so adept at conveying its emotional imagery to you without lyrics, which is a strength that the band continues. Kettering, basically the first line of the song immediately lets you know what you're in for, which is, I wish that I had known in that first minute we met the unpayable debt that I owed you, which is the line I think about every single day, just because it's kind of buried its way into my skin. This hurts. Everything about the pictures that this song paint, metaphorical and literal, make me want to curl up into a ball and sob. There's a tangible disconnect between the two main characters here right out of the get-go, that it paves the way for everything else that this album is going to do pretty flawlessly. The final half of the song being so discordant and noisy, it's just murder on my heart. And then you go into Sylvia, which is a bit more of a bombastic and explosive track at points that shows off the structural genius that was pioneered on Attic. About as close to catchy as this album gets, other than Bear. And when you look into everything lyrically, it makes you regret entertaining the notion that it's catchy. The vocals on this album, a lot of the time, are mixed even lower than they were on the last two at points, making you, it's one of those things where it's like the production of the album is teaching you how to listen to it as it goes along, sort of giving you its own sonic language. And that's a really smart thing. You have to pay attention to basically every detail of the production and lyrics. Also making every big euphoric rise that this track has feel like you are going to, pun partially intended, burst apart, which brings me to my quote unquote favorite song on the album, which is Atrophy. And I have one note for this song. I don't think I can talk about it, so I won't. It breaks my heart, and that is all I can say, because if I tried to say anything more than that, I would devolve into a weeping mess. 2 is another song that in terms of musical tonality is a bit more upbeat. Lyrically, however, it is pitch black, showing the toll the illness has taken physically in very often horrifying detail, but also how it's affected the main character. Hearing from the doctor that it's going to kill his partner, maybe a metaphor for someone telling them that their relationship is going to collapse. It accentuates how this relationship eclipses their entire worlds, respectively, how it feels like they're the two most important or even only people in the world, and how this sort of swallows them in their own toxicity. Shiva is that has this like beautiful lilting ascending and descending melody that carries the song, and it gets at a theme the album has been hinting around in terms of the interchangeability of the couple, how the sickness and deterioration affects both of them, but also in how they both are/feel responsible, and how the both of them seem to be both in and of themselves a victim and an abuser, and how none of this stuff is ever really truly black and white. The way Peter describes the pain of illness on this song is soul-wrenching, which goes to Wake, which my only note here is the lyrical passage. When your helicopter came and tried to lift me out, I put its rope around my neck, and after that, you didn't bother with the airlift or the rescue. You just knew what to expect. That with the door closed, the shades drawn, we're dead enough. They don't open from the outside, and someone has to speak with their teeth behind their tongue to never let that right be denied, which is basically one of the most lyrically perfect things I've ever heard in my life, maybe.
So true, King.
It's true, and then the song ain't done because it ends by being fucking Goodwill Hunting don't ever let anyone tell you that you deserve that, which I
a profound level of emotional catharsis is my assessment.
That's the thing, is that when I listened to this album, it spoke to that experience in me, and it made me sad, and it made me feel that. But now it's something that makes me sad, but also gives me solace. I hear it and I find comfort in its many nuances.
Something I want to add here, just on the note of this track, is and some could interpret this as a songwriting weakness. I don't personally, but I think it's notable the fact that this record outlines its complicated and thesis throughout all of these songs. But basically, in the bridge towards the very end of Wake, it's basically just Peter explicitly states it. Don't be scared to speak. Don't speak with someone's tooth. Don't bargain when you're weak. Don't take that sharp abuse. Some patients can't be saved, but that burden's not on you. I think it's very difficult to just basically state your thesis in such a blunt way and yet have it feel so naturally following from all the beautiful tangled webs of allegory that have led up to it. It just feels like this moment of earned clarity that is so affecting.
Final,
I think
Twilight Sad album vibes in that respect.
Yeah.
I think what works about it is that you have this portrait of a person sort of receded totally into themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And they're completely in their own interior, and they have lanced through all the layers of this metaphor directly into the core of what they're saying. And I think one of the reasons that it remains so effective is because the track that follows it almost refutes it. Even though there is this perfect clarity, it immediately reprises the melody of Bear, and the person is haunted by the memory of this other person, such that even perfect clarity doesn't make the ghosts go away. And it sort of it reminds me of the Blue Bucket of Gold, the final track of Carrie.
Yes, such a good comp. That's exactly the same tone.
Where there is a catharsis, there is a true catharsis throughout the course of Carrie and Lowell, and that it ends on its most sour note in many respects. To this idea that even once the story has ended, the story goes on. The trouble continues. You are the hobbits back in the Shire, not able to live the life you once had because the adventure you had changed you, because the experiences you had left you different than when you started. And that's what listening to the album feels like. You feel different when it's finished.
That is my favorite basically artistic device, is being able to, within your narrative, the principle of you can never really go back home. Just because if you have a story and it's, a story that's worth telling, when you close that loop and get to that end, if your characters, or if even you sort of see everything in exactly the same way, then the journey itself is diminished. So when you take a moment to begin, or to end where you begin, it really lets you recontextualize everything that brought you there in the first place, and is why an ending to a story is so paramount like that. And it's why stories about grief specifically that touch on that, I think, are so incredibly powerful. And it's very fitting that the final song, Epilogue, ends with maybe the most painful lyric ever, which is, "So lie down against your back until we're both back in the hospital, but now it's not a cancer ward, we're sleeping in the morgue." Yeah, the best way I can describe my thoughts on this record succinctly is that, despite the fact that it is clearly a project that is so very personal and specific to a very unique kind of pain and experience, whether or not it is a fictional creation, whether or not is it a semi-autobiographical thing, these things don't really matter. What matters is that the story here is so vividly drawn that you interpret it to be real. And that realness does not diminish your ability to relate to it, because when I listen to each of these songs, I remember a point in my life where I connect to that part of what causes pain from this, and I can imagine a very specific scene and how it makes me feel. And I think that's the key to emotional writing, is that you have to preserve enough of your own personal story and your own very specific idiosyncrasies and what makes the story that you're telling special, but also does not diminish people's ability to feel through it as an empathy machine, as it were, in the words of Mr. Roger Ebert. But yeah, I think this is an incredible emotional and musical achievement across the board. I can't praise it enough, and it's my third favorite album from this band. So like, they don't miss is what I'm getting at.
Yeah. Well, I think we've pretty much picked apart Hospice as much as is humanly possible. So we'll move swiftly along then to our favorite tracks and ratings. Jake, do you want to lead us off this time?
Sure. My three favorite tracks are Atrophy, Kettering, and Wake. Least favorite, not a bad song on here, but I'd have to say 13 if I had to pick one. And my rating is a 9 out of 10.
Awesome. My favorite tracks are probably Atrophy, Sylvia, and Wake. Jesus Christ, that's a hard pick though, and I don't have least favorite. I'm going to give it a 10 out of 10.
My three favorite tracks are Sylvia, 2, and Wake. If I had to pick a least favorite track, I think the only thing that's maybe slightly inessential is actually the prologue. But it's every real part of this is kind of, again, it's the Attic of the Universe thing, where it's all just this holistic package where it ebbs and flows in a very purposeful way. And it gets, much like Attic, a 9 out of 10 from me.
Nice.
My favorites are Kettering, which is overall my favorite Antlers song, 2, and Wake, which I think is my second favorite Antlers song, but I'll let you know I'm keeping a running list for this. So Kettering, 2, Wake. My rating is I'm actually raising it over the course of this conversation and having re-listened to it from an 8 to a 9. So I'm giving it a 9 out of 10.
Oh, fabulous. So that's another 9.3. I've already done what that.
I think it's really fitting that those, and Attic and Hospice, should both get 9.3s, because again, they're cut from the same cloth. They're expressions of different but related feelings through similar styles, with one being a much huger sounding to represent the enormity of the emotional trauma, and the other being much more introspective and small. As has already been stated, Hospice was a huge success and led to the aforementioned contributors Michael Lerner and Darby Stici joining the band proper, and they're actually fleshing out into a studio project. And in many ways, the record that would follow, 2011's Burst Apart, is in many ways the debut project of the debut release of a new band, really. And I think that's reflected in some comments that Peter made about the band's approach to writing and recording Burst Apart. He said, and I quote, "Burst Apart is the Antlers' 4th record, maybe individually my 7th record, but most importantly, our first record as a true band. Before now, we were my bedroom project, slowly expanding into a group and finding our musical footing. I found happiness in letting go of the reins this time, finding my place in a true collaboration, turning the Antlers from my project to our project." So Burst Apart is a really interesting and I think underrated record. It also got the Best New Music laurel from Pitchfork, but it was fair to say that because of what a shift in sound it is towards this more ethereal dream pop aesthetic that Zach has alluded to, people who I guess were entranced by the intensity in all respects of Hospice, perhaps maybe felt that this new direction held them in a bit of a distance. And it's a theme that I think basically probably continues for the rest of Antlers' career in terms of people who think of them as the Hospice band and then listen to their subsequent stuff. But I think, again, I've spoken about how I see an arc in the records of the Antlers and growing up, reckoning with who you are, processing the awful, unavoidable uncertainty of the world and the hurt that inevitably comes from being and living and existing, and eventually learning to process and grow and move forward. And I think that is more fully realized in terms of a thematic, holistic concept on the next record. But I'll open the floor again on this one for anyone who wants to kind of speak about what your perception is of Burst Apart in terms of the progression of the Antlers sound, and also what the record means to you.
I'll kick it. This is Pete Silberman Discovers Marijuana, the album. I'm pretty sure. As indicated,
half of the songs on here just
rolled together. Indeed,
there is simply no other interpretation for this. If you have ever put this album on under those circumstances, you will ascend because it's perfect for that. This is another. It is a big stylistic shift from Burst Apart, but not one that is without foundation. And I think ultimately one which I would tell you is, as Tyler is suggesting, the true expression of this band. They were always a lo-fi project to begin, but insofar as they were ever chasing that sort of microphones come Mount Erie sound, it wasn't so much trying to follow in Phil's sonic footsteps, but to follow in the sort of direction of creating a sound where the sound evokes an emotion and the emotion is the meaning of the record. And to me, these next three, the albums, are the band fully delivering on the promise of that concept. Whether you find them to be as personally moving as past projects is wholly up to you. But I think that, you know, I sort of cheekily alluded to Terrence Malick earlier, and I think that you can sort of see the same kind of trajectory where it sort of goes from more like narrative things with these aesthetic proclivities to being more driven by the aesthetic proclivity and the relationship between aesthetic and meaning. And that's sort of exactly how I see Burst Apart and Undersea and Familiars, which we're going to talk about. This is the beginning of that trajectory. I think that this from wall to wall is just like one of the most pleasant Antlers albums to listen to. It's certainly leaving behind some of the sonic harshness that you're going to find on Hospice tracks like Atrophy or Kettering. And instead you're getting a kind of mellow, spacious, textural dream pop sound. But still encoded inside of the DNA is the lyricism of Pete Silberman, now applying his very, interior, raw and emotional writing and lyricism, songwriting to a different sort of sonic context, which opens old emotional ideas up to sort of new flavors and experiences. When you look at the lyrics of I Don't Want Love, which is the opener of this album, or Putting the Dog to Sleep, which is the closer of this album, on paper, they are things that would fit on Hospice, even though they sound nothing alike. You wouldn't just drop them as is, but as they are written, the ideas, the strong nature of visual metaphor is still a really, really present driving concept. And that's, something that continues on down the track list with tracks like Every Night My Teeth Are Falling Out, which obviously references a sort of common psychological phenomenon, a dream that is common that a lot of people experience. And there's a lot of that sort of metaphorical, allegorical kind of content going on here, where if the last album is sort of about accepting inevitability and learning to move on and not holding yourself accountable. This is more truly about growing beyond your past experiences and the struggle that is, and also, you know, the purpose of it and the vitality of it. In the interest of not taking that much more airtime, I'll go ahead and close it there with the sentiment that when it comes to Antlers interlude tracks, which are something that kind of work their way through the discography up to this point, this is by far my favorite version of it. When I am listening to the instrumentals on this album, it's total bliss for me. From you know, detached from the narrative, detached from the themes. It's just, when you listen to this album in headphones, the production of it is absolutely immaculate, down to, you know, whatever track. There's not, you know, they've really shucked the lo-fi and embraced a fuller sound. And that's not better, it's not worse, but it's something where, you know, the songwriting, which has always lent itself to these sort of instrumental interludes, is now being used to sort of experiment in this new sonic way, and I find that to be really, really rich and rewarding, and something that, you know, continues on the next couple of albums as well.
I was gonna say that this is the best produced record they've made, but then I remembered the two things we're about to talk about afterward exist, and
yeah, my that's the thing with this record, is I can heap lavish praise on the way that it sounds, but it basically would all be with the caveat of up to this point in their career. And I think that, for instance, Corsicana is the most beautiful song the Antlers have recorded up to this point.
You're so right. Yes. You're so right.
Career.
Yes.
And that's, I think, maybe in terms of the less substantive, let's say, tracks and like the interludes, the smaller pieces, the connective tissue, I think Corsicana might be my favorite one of those on an Antlers record. It's this beautiful little, and it's almost like an extension of the track that precedes it, actually, Hounds, which is this beautifully empty but spacious song that is focused around Pete Silberman's ghostly vocal. And that's another thing that I think is really cool about this record, is that you see Peter, I think, experimenting a little bit more and perhaps gaining more confidence in his voice. Like, you definitely had that a significant gain in confidence with Hospice as well. I mean, you think of like the chorus of Sylvia, for instance, but here you get Peter doing more interesting and ethereal and unconventional things with his voice, taking on tones that are even at times eerie, unsettling, gritty. I think a real one of the most unique and idiosyncratic songs in the Antlers career is Parentheses, which sounds absolutely nothing like any other Antlers song, and is such a creative and brilliant alchemy of combinations of sounds, because it's this gritty, it almost reminds me of Portishead, this track, actually. It's this really kind of gritty, and it has this kind of clattering industrial looped beat. And
his warble, his vocal deliveries on that song are unlike anything he's ever done, and somewhat unlike anything I've ever heard. He's drawing into such like a falsetto, which he always uses, but it's this sort of like rich, deep version of it that's so unique to that song.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, it's a very strange aesthetic decision to sing like that over this instrumental. Like, it immediately stands out for how jarring it is, but it's very kind of, again, it gets across that feeling of an ethereal kind of waking dream, and I think that atmosphere is a auditory kind of representation of the processing that this record represents, the kind of moving forward in life. Because if you think about the function of I'm going to get a bit abstract here, but you think about the function of sleep and the function of dreams, they are recuperation, they are reflecting, so that your brain can integrate the information you've experienced and prepare you for a new beginning, a new day. And I think that the deliberate decision, as far as I can see, to so clearly and consistently evoke an aesthetic vibe that I can only describe as dreamlike on this record, is a way of hinting at that and suggesting at that. And specifically with regard to the theme of recuperation, reconciliation, moving forward, that's nailed again on a number of tracks here, but specifically putting the dog to sleep, which Peter has specifically said is about reconciliation, about two people who are mutually destructive, learning to overcome this aspect of their relationship, this aspect of their character. And Peter says that in a sense, it is me making peace with hospice and the events that inspired it. It's a song about moving on, about forgiving without forgetting. And I think it's meaningful as well. It's meaningful that I think this record does include a song like this, which so directly comments on events in the previous album. And in fact, you even get a song on Familiars, which when we get to is also a direct commentary on hospice and the events of hospice as well. So you can see that permeating the rest of the discography and serving, and these subsequent albums serving as making that connection as a way of making explicit the fact that the arc of this series is being vulnerable, experiencing something horrific as a part of your growing up, and then learning to process that and reclaim your identity, especially, and that's a big theme of Familiars. But yeah, this is the most consistently dreamlike and ethereal Antlers album, and definitely it does also have a definite kind of like psychedelic, hypnagogic, and undeniably a quality that would, let's just say, be enhanced by the use of substances. And so that I don't find myself with a lot of to say substantively about this record, but I think that it serves a much more modest purpose than Hospice, but still an equally important one. I will say there are moments on this record that I think I'm not as huge on. I think this is the only big Antlers record that has moments where I'm perhaps less enamored. One that particularly stands out is No Widows, which I find to be very muddy sounding in a way that I may be intentional, but I find it difficult to listen to that song in that form anyway. I've heard a live version of it, which sounds so much better. But for the most part, it's a record that sounds great. And I think meaningfully, it's that cursed word again, transitional. It's true, but it's not transitional in a way that's reductive, because Hospice is a record about that climaxes with a very important self-realization, and Familiars is a record about experiencing similar self-realizations when you're a bit older. And this is kind of like, this and Undersea are kind of like the journey in between. But I'd love to hear what others have to say again about this record, and whether you see anything more in it than I do, or anything different in it than I do.
I just want to thank you for using one of my favorite words that never gets used. That being hypnagogic.
One of the best words.
Oh, absolutely.
Anyway.
Yeah, like, you know how in like the Deftones back catalog, there's a point where they started using more like shoegaze and dream pop influences in their music, but it was a while until like the best albums where they'd do that. I feel similarly about this album in that I like it very much, but like everything nice I have to say about it, I have to say about Familiars more, and the EP in between more, I guess. And I agree that there are like sort of No Windows rolled together. Also kind of Tiptoe, I just have very little happening in my brain when I listen to them. But I love sort of the writing style and musical style of Antlers with these influences thrown in. It just works so well. And it's such a great idea for a combination of sounds and styles and influences, especially on tracks like The Closer Bring the Dog to Sleep, which is amazing writing and really sort of beautiful lyrics. the narrative, especially of that song, and the metaphors used work really well. Every night my teeth are falling out is like the biggest bop they've made up to this point. It's just so much fun.
Try and get
And
it off the floor.
but it's like it's also somewhat dark. It's somewhat harrowing.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
not.
Yeah.
I think one of my favorite things about this band is that every time they cut loose like that, it's always like lyrically the darkest damn. Like 2 is just the same way on Hospice, and if you're paying attention, you're like, this is fucked.
Yeah.
And I love
Yeah.
that sort of juxtaposition.
Like two is the one song on Hospice that's like instrumentally fun, but the lyrics are so fucking bleak.
Right.
And similarly with like every night my teeth are falling out. It's just I want to be clicking my fingers.
Yeah.
I'm like, yes, King, my teeth are falling out every night. Yes. But no, but it's still very dark. And Parentheses as well. A great song. I love the sort of brooding drums and sort of the sense that sort of pop in. Again, there was a Portishead comparison made to some songs on this album. I think that's super on point. And also like Hounds, great song, great track, and the opener as well is I love it. I just I listen to it and I just want to be listening to Familiars. But I still like it very much.
I think a strength of this record, that's uniquely a strength of this record, is the fact that the moments that stand out the most to me are moments where it's less about anything substantive and more about atmosphere. Songs like Hounds, Corsicana, Rolled Together, they're not particularly lyrically dense. I mean, Rolled Together is just 2 lines repeated. But it's all about the emotional headspace that the sound of it puts you in. And that's, I think that's even truer of Undersea, although I have to confess I haven't dug super into the lyricism of Undersea. That's just a record I listen to for the sound of it. But yeah, whereas I think Familiars is their greatest triumph because of the way that it's such a perfect marriage of frankly Peter Silberman's best writing ever and a sound that complements it perfectly and is wholly cohesive as a record. This is more, again, as I said earlier, more narrow in its focus and what it's trying to do, and I think it's perhaps easy to undersell it as a result of that, and perhaps it does not have the lasting impact of some of their other records, but I think it has its place in the discography for sure.
No, it absolutely does.
Jake,
the place that it has in the discography is you own the vinyl and you put it on and you bask in the construction of the sound of it. Like that's really the ideal. I think the biggest sort of issue with this album is that it's not Hospice and it's also not Beach House Bloom. It's just somewhere in the middle of those 2 sort of extremes where it touches on the greatness of both of them intermittently, but is mostly held together by like how nice it sounds.
Yeah. Jake, do you have anything you want to add about Burst Apart?
Yeah, there's an emphasis on this album that makes me, that reminds me a lot of another album I love, which is Perfume Genius's Set My Heart on Fire Immediately, in that it thematically feels that there's a thematic emphasis on this album being more about formlessness, about transcendence of the contained form that you have and becoming this like ethereal otherworldly thing. So this closer here, it like roots you in something that is so painfully human and heartbreaking. It's an inspired choice in terms of sequencing, I think, because it just sort of like starts as this wider thing and then sort of pulls into focus as the track list keeps going. So there is a bit of a structural progression here that I do think is worth noting, even if it's not as tight, I suppose, as the other ones. And yeah, I just love this record because I'm head over heels for how it sounds, and it strikes the balance of what they're trying to do, sort of an example of a transitionary album where I think it ends up benefiting from its transitionary qualities more than perhaps where they arrived after it. Not to say like to belittle what followed it, but it's just this one for me hits like every possible bullseye that it could, and I have returned to it many a times. So yeah,
Yeah, I think there's something really meaningful to what you said about like this feeling of transcending while listening to it, and it being a sort of in a sense, maybe just subtextually, or maybe it is just both of us reading into it, but this idea of kind of shedding a form and kind of just being an energy,
which I
more
think
than a
is
human.
an interesting narrative to explore, because when you have Attic, which is a thing that's about acceptance of smallness, it's a thing about embracing the fact that your life can go anywhere, and then Hospice is this sort of counteract of that, of just being like, well, all the paths that you're gonna go on, not all of them are free of pain. And then you have Burst Apart here, which is just like, well, now that you went down that path, let's try to break away from that shit. And I love that.
And what's interesting about this notion of form transcending, or of being outside of yourself, is that is explored in a lot more detail on Familiars. So that is, again, another reason why there's such a tight sort of progression here in this discography that I don't think gets appreciated enough when people talk about this band. But anyway, I think that we've basically said, unless anyone has anything else they want to add about this record, then we'll do our favorite tracks and ratings. My three favorite tracks are on this record are Corsicana, Putting the Dog to Sleep, and I will say, I'm going to say Rolled Together, actually. I think those three really get at what makes this record so unique. My least favorite track is No Widows, and I give this record an 8.5 out of 10.
So my three favorite tracks on this album are Parentheses, Every Night My Teeth Are Falling Out, and Corsicana. And I would give this a rock solid 8 out of 10.
Nice. So my favorite tracks are Parentheses, Every Night My Teeth Are Falling Out, and Putting the Dog to Sleep. And I'm giving it a 7.5 out of 10.
My three favorite tracks are Corsicana, Putting the Dog to Sleep, and Hounds. Least favorite track, probably Tiptoe, and I give it a 9 out of 10.
Okay.
Nice. So that's an 8.3 on average. What's up?
I'm just so deliriously excited for this next release.
Well, it's going to be fun. But an 8.3, Microphones in 2020. What an appropriate album to match up with. RTJ4, Man Alive, Spiritual Healing.
Company. So before we move on to Undersea, I want to shout out one thing in the interim. Later in the same year, the Antlers released a kind of remix album / studio sessions EP called Together. It is, funnily enough, it is 15 minutes longer than Burst Apart, which is like some real Sufjan Stevens, All Delighted People energy.
Yeah.
But anyway, this is not like certainly not an essential release, but it's a release I do find myself listening to from time to time because it kind of expands on the atmospheric qualities of Burst Apart more, and it gives you versions of the songs that sort of leave behind a lot of the busy detail and focus more on the pure atmospheric stuff. You get remixes of French Exit and I Don't Want Love that are really stripped down. You get an extended version of Hounds, which is worth checking out. You get a cover of VCR by the XX, which I think is a really interesting cover choice that speaks to the band's place within a particular kind of world of indie. Again, the XX's first record and Hospice were both big Best New Music picks for Pitchfork in 2009, the same year. So again, quite significant. But I really want to shout out the last two tracks on this remix EP, which is an extended version of Rolled Together, which is a collaboration with the artist Neon Indian that takes that song to up to 9 minutes. And I want to shout out the closing track on this thing, which is an extended jam session of Parentheses with the indie artist Beer in Heaven that stretches for 18 minutes long. And that is just like mostly focused around jamming the percussive loop of the track with these kind of manipulating the atmosphere around it. But that is a real fucking trip to just like experience in the same kind of substance induced,
like that 30-minute song on the end of Liar's
like
debut album, where it just like melts your brain out of your ears. You're like, whoa.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. So yeah, if you want to get a bit more of the vibe of Burst Apart, then I recommend checking out Together. It's not as good, but it's still a thing that I recommend for fans. But yes, so in 2012, the very next year, we get the most substantive non-album release from this band, which is why it's getting its own little segment in this video, the Undersea EP. And I can see Zach champing at the bit on this one. I know it means a lot to him. So Zach, why don't you talk about
Sure.
this EP, how it relates to Burst Apart, because I think it's inarguably an EP that's meant to accompany that record, but also where it sits in this particular juncture in their career and what your thoughts and feelings are on it.
Very briefly, I just love looking at the arc of a discography. And one thing that I really enjoy about it is looking at how a band manages to make their music, where, Swans records a studio album, tours it, releases that live album. And there's sort of a sequence to how they do things. And you can, following that sequence, sort of see how they build with their sound. And I think that something that the Antlers do is a trajectory that I enjoy from a lot of bands, where they'll make a project and they'll kind of experiment, and then they'll make a third project that is sort of the offspring of the original thing and the experiment. And so they don't have a strictly linear track. And what Hospice excuse me, I don't know why I said Hospice. Where Undersea kind of fits into this is that with Burst Apart, you have this bold new sound, and Hospice pushes that further, such that Familiars kind of gets the benefit of their experimentation sonically on Burst Apart. So what Burst Apart is, in my opinion, is 4 rolled togethers that are all a bit more ambitious than rolled together. It is almost anthological in nature. There is a progression to it, but all 4 songs exist as their own kind of unique, if you can imagine a box of chocolates, like little chocolate truffles. Each one of them is distinct from the others. It is the least holistic Antlers project, and it is probably like the most partitioned, even though sonically you're kind of brought into what is the sound of the album, or the EP, which is very kind of floating, liquid, atmospheric, just like the song Rolled Together. All of the songs have these sort of repetitive refrains on them, and all 4 of them kind of deal with existentialist ideas, and something that I think that Jake has touched on a lot with the EP length album In the Attic of the Universe, which is the feeling of smallness. When you get into the lyrics of this EP, for example, Drift Dive, the refrain is "a million pieces in a billion places." Millions referring to, a number of people, such that each body is indistinct from the others, but billion places such that there is an infinite amount of space between them. And so it's this idea of people being parts of a whole, as if drops in the ocean or atoms in a molecule, and the way that they must kind of come together. It is the pure abstraction of the kind of the writing of the last 2 albums, which are both about human connection, human relationships, the follies and difficulties of them. And this is almost like breaking that down on the philosophical level, while taking it aesthetically to its most sort of atmospherically blown out and kind of sensual, formal experience. I like this EP the same way that a person might like a Stan Brakhage film, like where it's just purely turn everything off and let yourself melt into it. But there is a real kind of thematic coherence to it that is only kind of available to you once you've sort of grappled with the lyrics of it, which you don't have to do because of how atmospheric it is necessarily. But you get to Endless Ladder, and you're talking about sort of the Sisyphusian, the utility. You're on an endless ladder climbing higher and higher, and it's about the smallness of a person's self. And ultimately, you come into Crest, where the refrain lyrics are closer to truth, but much, much further. This idea that each person is always sort of in the process of making progress in their life, and that there's kind of an infinite churn, but in the relaxing way where you sort of come to understand that not as the negative, toxic hospice version, but as the existentialist philosophy, existence precedes essence, and you must find the value in your own smallness and your own uniqueness and in your own journey, which I think are all things that end up becoming thematic cornerstones of Familiars. And then finally, the album ends with Zelda, which is one of my top 3 favorite Antlers songs. And I'm so happy that she's cooperating, because it is the namesake of this animal right here, whose name is also Zelda, who is named after this EP.
Oh,
Beautiful. I love it.
But the 4th track, Zelda, is this sort of like noirish, the horns and the atmosphere, and it's like you're watching a hard-boiled in space aesthetically, and lyrically, it kind of brings you back to some familiar ground, because it begins talking about a relationship between 2 people. He's addressing Zelda, which of course evokes the wife of F. Scott Fitzgerald, who is the namesake of the video game character, Princess Zelda, who the narrator of this track is you asked me to wake you if I woke up before you and you were still stuck inside. I'm here to tell you we're not awake yet. And so it's this idea of 2 people kind of caught in this liminal space where they are so small and they can't make progress, but they have a moment between themselves where they reflect on the way that their connection sort of defies the essence of the sort of noisy, expansive, quote unquote, meaninglessness that the rest of the EP has really been talking about, and how it is the connection that kind of grants you purpose and grants you direction. And that's such a profound thing to say when you're the band that made Hospice. And, you talk about how that connection can be very painful and can induce very, haunted things, to come around just a few years later and drop something where you say, but it is the connection that is the essence of all of us. And I find that to be very philosophically profound, and it's just a phenomenal sounding record. And I think it's just 4 gems, four gems of tracks, all 4 of them completely distinct, and yet they work together as a whole. Just everything I want from an EP.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add. One thing I will say is that for me, the key track here, although what you've just said about Zelda is very profound and a very kind of unique sentiment within this discography, so that makes that track mean a lot. But I want to draw attention to Endless Ladder, which I don't know if it's my favorite here. I kind of don't even know how I would rank these songs if I had to. But Endless Ladder has references to receiving a message from yourself in the future, and this idea of communicating with yourself outside of yourself, the externalization of different stages of your life as actual physical manifestations. And that is the heart of Familiars. That's what Familiars is about, every single song on that record, to a certain extent. And so I think it's quite cool that it's kind of, that theme is, it's the seeds of that theme are on records like Burst Apart and to a lesser extent Hospice, but it's kind of like blossoming here on a song like Endless Ladder, which I think is really awesome. Specifically the line, "If I receive a letter from 2017, I would know how to read it, but not what it means." This notion of the futility of trying to reconcile your past and extract the lesson.
If I may, we glanced on this earlier with the idea of hospice, leaving you on this note that once you've gone through the experience, you've changed, which connects to word to my guy Joe Casey of proto-martyr Heraclitus, the Greek philosopher who talks about the idea that no man can enter the same river twice, right? And the idea of recontextualization, the idea that from 2012 to 2017, you so profoundly change as a person that what you would be thinking would be an entirely new person speaking to you in a new language that you could barely comprehend because of how much the experiences of your life change you.
Yeah. And and I think if there's one lesson that the EP tries to teach, it's this notion of learning to accept. And I think that's encapsulated with the title of the track, Drift Dive. So drift diving, for those who don't know, is a form of scuba diving where instead of kind of going against or perpendicular to the current, you go with it. You let the current kind of pull you along and take you in as you kind of go underneath the water. And so I think that's a very intentional evocation and a very kind of delightful metaphor for this notion of trying to stop being at war with the past and trying to stop necessarily fighting your past self or trying to change the outcome of things or alter something that can't be altered. Learning to accept, I think, is at the core of the EP. And of course, that is reflected, that metaphor and that image is reflected in the cover art for the EP as well, which shows someone drift diving. But I like the fact that the cover is photographed in such a way where they look, it looks almost turbulent, what the diver is experiencing on the cover of this EP. But in reality, if you were to take it from the track title Drift Dive, that this is someone who is drift diving, then it's actually a surrendering, not a turbulence. But it appears that way. It appears to be turbulent, but in reality, it's necessary. And it's once you stop fighting, once you stop seeing the turbulence, then you're able to move on with the task, with the job, with your life. And that's something that is expanded upon heaps in Familiars, as we'll get to really soon. But I think that this EP is an absolute triumph in the way that it communicates that in such a subtle way, and so effectively. And again, there's not a weak moment on this EP. I adore it every bit as much as Zach, I think, and I've come to appreciate it more and more over the years. And just
as my favorite Antlers release.
Just as a side note as well, I actually, the first time I heard this EP when I was getting into the Antlers, was a time when coincidentally I was taking a scuba diving course, and I was learning to dive.
Oh shit!
Wow. And it doesn't really mean anything, but like it felt like there was an obvious surface level parallel there, but that was fitting for the numerous emotional and psychological parallels that the music also had to my life at the time. It was like someone had
Tyler sneaking in Bluetooth headsets under his scuba set to listen to Undersea while he's in the water.
That's got to be like a tenuous Bluetooth connection there.
But yeah, it's like it's just one of those many ways in which my connection to this band is so ironclad, because everything about what they're doing and everything about the way Peter writes and sings and performs, it feels like something that is made for me. One more thing I'll add in terms of progression is that one thing that emerges really strongly on this EP, and again blossoms in a big way on Familiars, is the use of the horn section.
The brass.
And the brass instrumentation. You get immediately coming in on Drift Dive and then prominently on Crest as well.
Yes, I was really going to talk about that on Familiars, because that's a big part of my opinion on the sound of that record, but I'm really glad you put it up here.
That's Darby Sicci is the brass instrumentalist contributor. And so that is a facet of their sound that I think, again, seeds are here, it'll blossom in Familiars. But unless anyone else has anything they want to add about this EP, we can move on to our favorite tracks and ratings. Jake, why don't you kick us off?
My three favorite tracks are they're all great. There's not a weak one. There's not a weaker one. It's 8 out of 10.
Nice.
Saoirse.
Right. So it's 4 tracks. So I'm not going to pick 3 favorites. They're all really good. And it's also an 8 for me.
Okay, it's an exercise in futility. I don't have favorites or least favorites. I'm going to give this a 9.5 out of 10.
Same sentiment. I guess I would say that just for the sake of saying it, my least favorite track is probably Crest. I think that Pete's vocals are really interesting on it. All 4 songs are really strong, but like that's probably the least interesting to me. It's just that helps form the top 3. I'm gonna give it the same score as Tyler. I'm gonna hit it with that 9.5.
Oh my God.
Sick.
So that's 8.8 if we're rounding it, but only just.
Okay. The Antlers begin work in 2013 on their 5th studio album. It's released on Anti in the US, which I think is an interesting label for a record like this, in June of 2014. This, incidentally, is very shortly after the time that I discover and get into this band, which is around April of 2014, around about the time of my 17th birthday. And so I definitely have a particular affection for this record that's no doubt due in part to my experience with discovering this band at the time it came out. But I want to try and make a case without being unintelligible because I haven't prepared notes. I'm going to try and make a case for this as the Antlers' crowning achievement and the greatest and most profound synthesis of all of the themes and ideas and everything that the band have pursued, and also the most life-affirming Antlers record as well. It's a sad record, but it's as bittersweet as it is sad, as it is uplifting. It is a record that traverses the emotional spectrum. It is a record about I say this like I'm not fucking 23, but it's a record about reaching a certain stage in your life where you have a newfound clarity on the stages that preceded it, and you're finally able to achieve closure with a particular part of your past. And I think that even though there are other reasons why the Antlers went on hiatus after this record, it is also fitting that it did represent the end, at least of an era for the band, because it is such a it feels like the logical endpoint of everything they've gotten to, but not just a logical endpoint, but it feels like the best case scenario. It feels like the piece that you are rooting for Peter to achieve throughout the turmoil of the records and the things that he sings about is finally found. And it's found in a way that's so poetically roundabout and just life-affirming that I am reduced to tears nearly every single time that I listen to it. Basically what Peter is writing about on this record is he's writing about these physical, not even just physical, but like also spiritual and less tangible manifestations of his past, manifestations of people and he used to be, experiences he used to have, stages of his life, and also other people as well. And it's a record about actually confronting those different manifestations and wrestling with them in a certain extent to find peace and to find to actually extract the lessons and be able to achieve the closure that you've been seeking for years and years and years and years. There's a real sense of a fight for this on this record as well, and I draw your attention to one of my favorite tracks on the record and one of the best Antlers songs ever, which is Intruders, which I think is just this gorgeously aching song about directly perceiving this past self as manifesting as this creature that's trying to hunt you, this stranger. So trying to wrestle with him and capture him. And then there's this heart-wrenching moment at the end of the song where Peter sings, "With his hands bound, I beg for answers to all my questions, like what happened? Why did you let me let you in when I was younger? And why do I need to?" which fuck, that part of that song, like I'm like bellowing that in the car last night and any given night where, because this is my Antlers car album, and
You're spitting.
it's just this real fucking raw desperation and aching, and it would not feel as rewarding and meaningful as it does if it wasn't a part of actually achieving closure, which Peter does on this record. So I'll backtrack to the opening track, Palace, which is my favorite Antlers song, and I think the most beautiful thing that they've ever made. It has the swelling build and climax of a post-rock track, but it has a real sense of intimacy in the singing and just the lush prettiness of every instrumental aspect of it. That's the thing as well. This record is relentlessly pretty, even in the moments where it gets more quote unquote aggressive. Like the most aggressive moments on this album are like tiny little tonal changes in the guitar at the climax of this song, or during the midsection of Surrender, for instance, where you get a tiny bit of distortion and it's like this breaking through moment. But for the most part, this is just so gorgeously serene and surreal. Again, it expands on that dreamlike vibe of Burst Apart, but instead of just kind of being in a dream, you're in this whole fucking universe of fragmented memories and ephemera of your past that you're navigating. Doppelganger is obviously quite an explicit expression of this notion of a duality between you, who you are now, and some manifestation of yourself that is, in this case, this horrific creature. I love how unsettling and eerie Doppelganger is. It's one of, I think, my favorite, again, another one of my favorite Antlers songs ever, just because of how purely perfect of a realization it is of its very specific atmosphere and its very specific theme. Can you hear me when I'm trapped behind the mirror, a doppelganger roaring from my silent kind of furor? If you're quiet, you can hear the monster breathing. Do you hear that gentle tapping? My ugly creature is freezing. And now he's howling, but I'm muted by the horror. He's everywhere and waiting. Now he's just around the corner. This is such a marvel of a track, and it's just, and I think every song on the record succeeds in the same way as this one does, in terms of being so committed to a very specific kind of atmosphere and complementing that absolutely perfectly with lyrics that feel so suited to the music, but also expand on it in lots of interesting ways. Hotel was the lead single on the record, and again, it's one of the more explicit moments about reckoning with the past and the past self. The metaphor of the hotel as this manifestation of peace and serenity that you're trying to make your home instead of just this place that you're visiting. My close behind Palace as my second favorite song on the record, and another top 3 Antlers song probably, is Director, which I think is one of the most lushly impressive instrumental palettes of the record. It is, again, you have this manifestation of a duality, but this time it's in the context of the present self, or the older, more mature self, being this orchestrator of the past, this director watching his past self rehearse the same endless kind of mistakes and tragedies that have kind of perpetuated themselves. The lyricism here is just fucking stunning. You say, lend me your eyes to evolve from that actor I fight in the dark, where I'm two twins I can't tell apart. But you remember which is which. When the wrong man wins, you will hate who you are till you overthrow who you've been. When he's delivering those lines, there's this swell in the instrumentation, and his voice is rising through this verse till he's practically howling that till you overthrow who you've been line. And the moment he says that, you get this beautiful kind of explosion of gorgeous guitar noise, and then it's just this like ringing note that just shimmers out into the atmosphere. And then following that, though, that note, which iterates a few times, you get this like what I can only describe as a sound palette that quite strongly recalls Burst Apart, where it's this kind of like arpeggiated shimmering sounds that feel liquidy, and it's like you have risen to this realization, and then it's this cathartic moment, and then you just fall back and you just float through space. And oh my God, it's amazing. And then you have a final verse in the song. How do you expect your whole soul so how do you expect your soul to send a whole patrol if you were too far gone for me to know where to find you? Which is one of the best couplets about depression that I've ever heard in a song. I've wandered out alone into your cold unknown to try to bring you home. So you forgot your way while I'm trying to remind you. And again, this surge of emotion in Peter's voice as he's singing these lines, this ascending to that explosion again after it. It's just one of the most emotionally cathartic songs I've ever heard in my life. Revisited is a particularly interesting song to talk about in the context of an Antlers discography deep dive, because it is a reflection on the events of Hospice. This is one of the few songs where you can argue Peter is either addressing his past self during that relationship, or he's addressing his partner, and commenting on, it's actually quite a meta song. He's commenting quite actively on the way in which he mined the events of that relationship for Hospice. He says lines like, and refers to the success of that album and the way that this incredibly intense personal thing that he communicated in this album became this huge monolith within a particular culture. In the opening lines, he says, when some unfamiliar faces came to shop in our old house, I didn't bother trying to stop them until they emptied it out. I was standing by the front door, stuffing cash in a jar, taking payment for our failures. I only wanted to alarm you. So when they asked me for directions, I sold them our map. I sold our shovels and our flashlights. They took our duffel bag with a ton of room, but a broken strap. The hungry patrons hit the graveyard. I lit a joint in the house where there was nothing but our mattress and the same soft shelter of sheets where nobody found us. I think that last part, a direct lyrical allusion to a line in Hospice about wrestling under sheets, I think, or being in bed together. I let them strip your mausoleum so nothing was left, but they forgot to close the casket. They sent you shivering to my doorstep, gently clawing at my window when I was less than awake. I slid it up for you to slither through. I heard you howling, just take me to the rusty city we perfected, that holy summer we first found. This is like epilogue 5 years on, like it's that continuation of the memories of the past and the trying to move forward but being bound to them, and yet it's wrapped up within this meta narrative of the way in which this story has become not just a traumatic part of Peter, a traumatic era in Peter's life when he was in the relationship, but it's come to kind of define his identity as an artist because of the success of that record. And he's reflecting on how he has grown as a person and as an artist, and yet how difficult that has been because of the way that as both he has been tethered to this traumatic relationship. And it's such a profound expression of that. And again, the writing here is so lyrically poetic and visually brilliant in a way that Peter has been in the past, but it feels like he's grown and is so much more ambitious with that imagery now. I just have to keep reading lyrics to highlight this. The place you're stubbornly protecting is the only pretty thing that we own now, and we can stay here to wither in your Garden of Eden, but your fantasy's a prison and you're serving a sentence you can't stop repeating. Fuck, man.
Just
Fuck.
the wordplay of a sentence you can't stop repeating. The duality of this, like,
Yeah, exactly, because it comes back to that thing of like having to mine those same subjects within the actual lyricism again and again.
I wanted to call out a thing I didn't want to interrupt you at all, but there's a point when you're talking about shovels, maps, and flashlights, and I can't help but listen to that and hear the glow part too, my friend. Because I mean, frankly,
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's that again, that through line is just there. And then you go into a song like Parade, which I think is
my favorite.
Yeah, I mean, it's gorgeous. It has this beautifully lilting melody that's immediately quite addictive. It's one of the more serene songs on the record, relatively speaking, yet it has this beautifully blossoming bridge where the key changes and then it comes back into the chorus, and it's like the most fucking gratifying return to a motif ever. And I since this is Zach's favorite song, I'll let him kind of speak about it in detail. I just wanted to mention it. And then I think I alluded to the notion of coming to the realization that moving forward means accepting the things that have happened in the past, not trying to redact or retroactively change them. It requires a form of surrender. And then lo and behold, you have a song on this record called Surrender. And it's again one of the more kind of blissful. It represents an arc in the final third of this record where you're actually moving towards that acceptance, that peace that I said at the start of my review. The writing here is just flawless. It touches again on that duality of speaking to your past self. I hope that you can't hear what I'm thinking. You know I can't always talk, but I'm always listening. In an absence where you hate to feel uncared for, pretending there's nothing that you're not prepared for. Who are you lapping when you're running from surrender, if life is a fatal race for all contenders? To find the peace within the combat where we're standing, we have to make our history less commanding. I mean, I don't even need to comment on this writing. It's so beautiful and it's so meaningful and perfect in terms of encapsulating the happy ending of the arc, the being in your mid-20s and reflecting on probably your mid-30s for Peter in this case, but like, and reflecting on being a teenager, being younger, and it's just such a bittersweet realization. And I'm starting to repeat myself now, but I'll wrap it up with a brief discussion of the final track, which I think is the beautiful bow on all of this. The sense of when your battle with your trauma and your battle with the past is a battle to find comfort, is a battle to achieve a mental space that feels like home, and the realization that that thing you're seeking, the seeds of that have always been within you, have always been a part of you. It's just been something that has been out of your vision by the shit you've experienced has kind of stood in front of it. And now you're able to stop fighting, to go with the drift dive, let those obstacles recede and see the home that's always been there. You're already home and you don't even know it. You have a room you can return to and you'll never outgrow it. It's not our house that we remember. It's a feeling outside it when everyone's gone, but we leave all the lights on anyway. This notion that even when it's that place you're trying to seek is in the distance, it's still a beacon that you can wander towards, that you can work towards, that will only get closer to you. And it's such a life-affirming sentiment. And look, this album has meant so much to me over the years. It has been both the toolkit I've needed to process my own past and the awful shit that I went through as a teenager in relationships. And it's been, by the same token, simultaneously also the thing that has guided me through that, the thing that has helped me to remember, even at the worst moments, that this isn't the entirety of my experience. and that the things that I'm seeking, the things that I know exist because I felt them at a time when I was younger, or I've experienced them in brief spurts between the agony, between the depression. Those things are not things I need to manifest. They are things that have always existed that I need to let myself find, and not feel like I need to be constantly fighting a battle. And that is the arc of the Antlers as a project, I think. Learning to accept that living life is not this battle you have to be constantly fighting with defenses, throwing up defenses all the time. It is this thing that happens to you. And the only way to find a true contentment begins with the acceptance of that things are just going to happen to you. And that once you accept that, then you can do anything you want. You can go through anything you want. You can forge whatever pathway you want, knowing that home is always a thing that exists in some ephemeral form, whatever emotional, psychological thing that represents, is always going to be there. And I've been really long-winded, and I probably should have written that down so it was a bit less babbly, but I think I've expressed why this album means what it does to me, and why I think it is the vital capstone to the arc of this story. And I'm curious, it only makes me more curious to see how this new album, Green to Gold, fits. It's clearly the beginning of a new era, but I'm wondering how it will relate, if it will relate to any of the things that these records talked about. But I won't be upset if it doesn't, because there was a satisfying conclusion in all respects with this album, and I love it. It is my third favorite album of the decade. Anyway, so I realize that I have a particular fervor for this record that maybe not everyone specifically shares, but I am curious to hear how people feel this fits in the progression of the Antlers to them, how it sounds, what you take away from your experience with this record, if anything.
But I think Familiars is sort of just the most mature, perhaps most sonically ambitious Antlers record that feels like a culmination of everything that came before it, especially when you have to consider Undersea, which I think Zach sort of pointed out that he loves when bands sort of like go off on a tangent and they sort of like explore, they have like a detour and they kind of like explore it a little bit further with something else. And I think that they take everything that they were progressing with naturally and the detours that they took and just kind of all fused it pretty seamlessly into this album, which makes it feel like, this is the sort of, in a way, it's like the quintessential Antlers album, I think, even more so than Hospice, just because Hospice is still just one very particular facet of their sound. Because if you say that that's the quintessential Antlers album, I can't fault you, but also it ignores like half of their career because of what they would do later with it. So I think the structure and flow of their early work here is preserved in a way that probably wasn't as much so on Burst Apart. But it does have the adventurousness of that album, and it has the emotional content of stuff like Hospice and Attic. I think the only real if you can even call it a weakness of the album, is really that it's just less my tempo than Burst Apart is that it's just like Burst Apart is really an all-purpose Antlers album. That's like whenever I want to listen to this band, that's like my go-to record, whereas this is like definitely a more distinctly slow, more methodically paced, kind of got to be in a very specific mood to digest it fully and to absorb what it's going for. It's sort of like all of its tracks are so very holistic. They're so very distinct and well-formed. There's no like interludes or things that feel like extraneous. Like the fat has been trimmed and yet everything has been explored. So it's just, it's another fucking great album, and it's another great step in the narrative of the band. And honestly, I feel like this only gets better with time, and I feel like after the next album, I feel like it might even let me appreciate this one even more, just as a specific moment for them, as I keep alluding to it being. But it's like, it's definitely a little bit more careful, more measured, more mature, which I think is necessary after you went a bit more ambitious with the last record. Maybe didn't hit all of the bullseyes that perhaps that they wanted to. Maybe not as consistent as Hospice. But this, I would say, is as consistent. It's just more about what you prefer from this band. But I think it's terrific. Familiars is great. It's maybe my least listened to project aside from the debut. But again, that's just because very, very, very specific vibe that it's going for. But I do think it is exceptional. Terrific album.
A couple of things I want to add. You're right. It's quite curious to say that this is, and you're right to say that this is the most fat trimmed, well, maybe the most, I don't know if it's the most, but certainly one of the most fat trimmed Antlers records. And yet it is the longest Antlers album at 53 minutes. And so I think that speaks to the aesthetic foundation of the record. It is very measured. It is very slow. I would say it's the most musically consistent Antlers record in the sense that there's really no kind of abrupt changes in volume or tempo.
Nope.
Like there are on every other Antlers record. It's very much kind of in a very specific mid-tempo, low to mid-tempo atmosphere. And in that respect, I think it feels like an even more successful execution of the dreamlike vibe of Burst Apart. The way that I said that record was dreamlike, and that record was like taking you into a dream, and this record is like being in a universe-sized dream world. And another thing I hope that you do come back to it at least a few more times, because I want to say as well that this wasn't like a first listen favorite for me. I did listen to this a few times before I realized that I loved it, even when it came out. But one additional thing I want to add that I forgot to talk about in my review is that there's another analog you can attach to interpreting this record, and specifically interpreting the idea of a duology between your current self and another alternate manifestation of yourself. And it's also a reading that has gotten more meaningful to me in recent years, and that is a reading relating to dysphoria, and perhaps feeling a distance from who you are on some level that you are trying to reconcile so that you no longer feel this disconnect. And this record to me makes me feel better about my own dysphoria in the same way that it makes me feel better about my own past traumas, because it tells you that yes, these things exist, but they don't define you, and there is a peace that you can achieve, and that is you know, it's not this thing you necessarily have to fight for. It's this thing that is deep inside of you that there are just simply obstacles in the way of you seeing. And so I think what's so beautiful about the external manifestations of self that this record explores is that you can read them in so many different ways. Just like how with Hospice, you could read the allegory in that story as an allegory for a few different things, or you could read it purely directly. That's what makes Peter such a great writer, and I think it reaches its apex on this record.
Okay, so Tyler, I want to say everybody, every one of these reviews has been great. I've been really looking forward to hearing yours, because ever since we first met, we've both been fans of the Antlers, and we've each kind of talked to each other a bit about our favorite Antlers projects, what we like about the band. So it was really great to hear you kind of detail why Familiars means so much to you, because I've known that for a long time, and I've always sort of wanted to hear the whole spiel. So that was very nice, and thanks for sharing it. When I got to this album, I got to this album in real time, having been, of course, acclimated to everything the band had done up to that point. So I experienced this like as it happened. I saw this record toured, the whole bit. I was involved in every step of it, and the parallel musically that I would point to. There's actually two that are kind of askance. The more odd one, but that corresponds with this exact same year, is the post-hardcore band Pianos Become the Teeth. They are a band who released an album in 2011, the year of Burst Apart, that was about the death of the frontman's father, similar to Carrie and Lowell, if you will. And after that point in 2014, the same year as this released, they released an album called Keep You, which has the same kind of like tonal disparity, where one is very mired in the, you know, upsetting material, and the other one is about sort of looking back at that material from a vantage point of having sort of grown and healed. And that's of course about a very specific trauma in an artist's life, whereas this is more ensconced in metaphor and really extrapolating the relationship between songwriter and material.
Another parallel that I'll bring that dovetails nicely with that is Touche Amore from Stage 4 to Lament.
So the other album that I would compare it to, and this is relevant to my earlier talking about Hospice and Pitchfork, if Hospice is kind of akin to Twin Fantasy 2011, I think that you could draw a parallel also between Burst Apart and the car seat headrest follow-up Monomania. They have kind of a similar trajectory, and this album is a lot like Twin Fantasy 2018, which of course is a re-release, a re-recording of that album with a fuller band, just like Antlers gained a fuller band. And this is a new album and not a remake of that album, and I certainly like this more than I happen to like that. No shade to anybody, but it has that similar kind of relationship of an artist kind of coming back to old material. And that album is also one which deals with dysphoria, although not the songwriter Will Toledo's, but his love interest Kate Wirtz, who is a trans woman. And that album also deals with, you know, just that cover art of the two albums is damn near identical. If you look at the Twin Fantasy album art, it's a little doodle by Kate Wirtz of two anthropomorphic dogs embracing.
Shit.
And the cover of Familiars is these kind of two identical men. And I've always loved the imagery of this album cover, because it is if they're fighting, they have like a grip on each other, like they're wrestling, but they also look like they're in embrace. And that's sort of what the album is about, is the push and pull with one's own kind of relation, not only within one's own mind, as if you are two people within yourself, but also with yourself and your externalized ideal of yourself, which is something that is not unique to artists, but explored very often through art, and the idea of persona, and the idea of, you know, I think of Conor Oberst talking about on Lifted, about this sort of person that he puts out on stage to sell his own misery, like he's, you know, earning a buck because he had feelings one time. And the complexity of that relationship is something that's, and something that is just necessary when an artist matures, especially when they have a work like Hospice that so completely takes in a certain culture. There is just an idea of oneself that an artist has to reconcile with, because as we've been discussing this entire time, if you receive a letter in 2012, you know, like this idea that as you progress through your life, you change. That is what this is about, the idea that time recontextualizes your past. And so this is not only a stylistic capstone to the Antlers, where they are throwing every sonic idea they've ever worked with into one package with some of Pete Silberman's best songwriting and lyricism, but it is specifically about the idea of recontextualizing, such that as a cap, it points you back to the beginning. And it kind of becomes this sort of iterative loop of narrative coherent material that is all really thematically consistent and compelling. What I will say about this album, and this does relate a little bit to my comparison of the 2018 Twin Fantasy, I am not as partial to the sound of it as I am to Undersea, which is a bit more sparse and a bit more kind of like, both are slow moving. This almost feels like I would have preferred it. The subject matter of this is like the Jose Saramago novel, Denis Villeneuve movie Enemy, where it's a metaphorical, almost like surreal, these interrelationships between a person. One of my favorite tracks on this album is Hotel, and Intruders,
Yes.
which Tyler brought up, where it's like it is literally fighting with oneself. But the imagery of Hotel, it's a scene in the movie Enemy. It's Jake Gyllenhaal meets Jake Gyllenhaal in a hotel room,
You're
and
right.
they have a conflict with each other. And I sort of it's not that I want it to be like the movie. I sort of wish this album was a little bit more aggressively into its aesthetic, like more out there. It feels like it's really restrained and within its own lines, and it's got these bold, beautiful lines. And I just almost wish it was a bit weirder. It's their most accomplished material, but in a way, it almost makes it a little less emotionally compelling to me, because they've so successfully been evocative with lo-fi and with these sort of middle steps that it's like you get to this culmination. And I love the song Parade. I love the song Directors, and you know, I love all the lyrics and ideas, but none of them necessarily like just it's such a personal taste based thing, I guess. But it doesn't necessarily bring it out of me in the way that, like, you know, I think of Stairs to the Attic, like where it just explodes, and I'm like, I think partially some of Peter's vocal deliveries are, you know, that of an accomplished vocalist as opposed to that of a young vocalist who's really pushing himself, you know, to reach these certain things. It's like he's this old professional doing it, which of course is part of the narrative of the album. And, you know, one of the beautiful things about the Antlers is that all of these projects come together in a beautiful and, yes, holistic way, such that you can find the part of the arc that most speaks to you, and that's the one that you prefer, but it does not diminish any of the other parts. All of the parts in the cycle are enhancing all of the other parts simultaneously. When I'm listening to Wake, I'm now thinking about Familiars. The catharsis of that song, I know, has like an even more bright, shiny, cathartic end moment. And that is really how I view everything that this band has done, is just like this collective mass of material. And with that, I'll just transition into saying I'm super fucking thrilled that we're getting a new one. I wouldn't say that I never thought it was going to happen, but I wasn't sure that it ever would. And it's really, really cool that we're going to get to see the next step. And, you know, I'm just very, very curious about it.
Well, yeah, and the circumstances regarding the hiatus and reformation of this project are interesting, and I'll touch on them in a bit in a minute, but probably mostly when we review the new album. But I think it's fair to say that we've did a pretty good discussion on this record. So let's move into our favorite tracks and ratings. Jake, why don't you kick us off?
Okay. My 3 favorite tracks on the record are Hotel, Intruders, and Refuge. Least favorite track, if I had to pick one, maybe Revisited. And I give the album an 8.5.
Nice. So that's me next. My favorite side, Doppelganger, Revisited, and Parade. It's getting an 8 from me.
My 3 favorite tracks, if I had to pick the 3, they would be Director, Palace, and Intruders, I guess. Although I do want to shout out Revisited as well, because that's definitely the biggest grower on this album, I think, Revisited, especially once I unlocked what that song was about. I don't think there's a single weak point on this record, and obviously I'm going to give it a 10 out of 10.
Nice.
It's my 3 favorites: Parade, Palace, and Director. And I will back up Jake. I'm going to hit it with that 8.5.
The Fellini special.
That's right. That's right.
God, the way this podcast
means it has the same average as Undersea.
Yes,
beautiful.
Which is true. God, the taste we have collectively displayed today, I'm just really happy.
So just as a footnote, before we do our typical album ranking and favorite track lists, I want to mention the fact, just because we're talking about a narrative of the band, so it would be silly to just stop here. So the band did tour this record, and during the tour for this record, in fact, I think quite early during the tour for this record, Peter Silberman experienced what can only be called a devastating and life-altering tinnitus explosion. And to the point where playing live in 2015 or 2016, around then, became virtually impossible. He lived in an existence where most sounds provoked complete agony in his head, And I don't believe that's the sole reason the Antlers dissolved, but certainly it wouldn't have helped the situation. Also worth noting that Darby Sicci left the project after this record and won't be contributing to the next one. But anyway, this state of being that Peter was in, of incredibly painful and debilitating tinnitus, led to the writing and release of his first and so far only solo record, 2017's Impermanence, which is, I think, up there with Mark Hollis's self-titled album as one of the quietest albums I've ever heard in my life, for understandable reasons. Peter is only able to make so much sound before that process becomes unbearable. And so what this record is it's incredibly stripped down, very much oriented around acoustic guitars, his vocals, and these swirling soundscapes. So, and the reason I really emphasize this project is that it does feel like a kind of postscript to the Antlers in a certain sense, because it's not just like short songs. There's only about 6 songs in this album, and multiple stretch beyond 8 minutes. And there are these soundscape tracks where Peter sings about the experience of being completely debilitated and taking stock on his life in a completely new way to familiars, because he's reflecting on the things he is, as far as is concerned, may never be able to experience again. And there's beautiful songs on this record like Karuna, New York, and Ahimsa, which are these odes to the gentle memories and silence. But what I love about this record is that it's not a sad album at all, really. It's a bittersweet album in certain ways, but it's a tranquil record. It feels like Peter making peace with the situation that he's in. And I don't know if any of you ever had the chance to check any of these songs on it out, but anything that any of you want to add?
I own this bad boy on vinyl. I find it very moving. I like it basically about on the exact same level as In the Attic of the Universe and Burst Apart, which is to say a great deal. I think the production on it is not only incredible, but it's very moving. And it's a really unique project. There's very little else in music like it. There's basically no one else that could have made it. and I think it's sort of the most significant thing that I can say about it is that it's like watching Peter Silberman apply the wisdom of the Antlers arc onto something that happened to him in his own real life because of the Antlers arc. It's like the relationship of what his music has always been about, like, happened in his life in real time, and then he like made an album about it that perfectly sort of sensually recreates like what it is he's talking about, and the delicacy of life, and the delicacy of one's own body and one's own existence, and how fragile that is, and how important it is to kind of like accept the moment as much as you possibly can, and like, try to embrace within the scope of your own limitations everything that your life can be. And it's just very affirmational and beautiful and moving. It's a great album.
Beautifully said. Yeah, it is fascinating on that level of the way that there's this meta subtext, because the situation, as you say, did arise as a result of indirectly having this project. And so it's interesting seeing it's interesting in that meta way, in the same way as Revisited off of Familiars is interesting in a more direct meta way. And it'll be interesting to see whether the next Antlers record, because I haven't listened to them with much focus, but I have like kind of clicked into some of the singles that they've released for the upcoming record. I didn't want to really focus on them because I wanted to save it for the full album.
They're so, we've talked so much about the holistic value and how they contextualize and recontextualize. There's just something that feels wrong about listening to any of it out of context.
Yeah, right.
But I wanted to get a sense of what the sound was going to be. And it seems to me like the sound of the upcoming Antlers record might follow more from Impermanence to some extent than from the Antlers' previous records, especially considering the fact that Darby's no longer in the band, and it's going to be much more focused around simple guitar arrangements than the ornate horn and brass arrangements of Familiars and Undersea. So we'll see how it pans out. I'm very excited for it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that context when we review the record. It's coming out on I just gotta get the date right, because I know it's coming out on the 26th of March, and we'll be reviewing it the following weekend. So we'll be able to have a week with it, as we do with every new release, and we'll be back here and break it down. But yeah. Okay, so as is traditional on the Jams and Tea discography deep dives, we rank the albums just for fun, including the EP in this instance, and we give a list of our top 10 favorite tracks from the artist. So we'll go in our regular alphabetical order, I suppose. Jake, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Are we doing albums or songs first?
Do albums and then songs.
Okay. Albums at the bottom we got Uprooted. Then I'm gonna go with Undersea. Then Familiars. Then Hospice, Burst Apart, and then In the Attic of the Universe. And for songs, my top 10 is 10. I have Hounds. 9, Zelda. 8, Hotel. 7, Shiva. 6, Corsicana. 5, Kettering. 4, Putting the Dog to Sleep. 3, Wake. 2, Atrophy. And number 1, Stairs to the Attic, parenthetical, the entire album.
The entire fucking thing. Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, Saoirse.
All right. So if I'm ranking the full-length albums, then that means
you can include Undersea in your ranking, because
it's fairly straightforward where Undersea is for me because of the ratings I gave them, I guess. But for me, it's Uprooted, Burst Apart, probably Undersea, Familiars, Hospice, In the Attic of the Universe. It's my favorite record, even though it only has one song that I've included on my top 10 Antlers tracks, which isn't ranked. I'm just going to read them out in the order I wrote them down. Uprooted, Stone Thrower, Stairs to the Attic, Wake, Atrophy, Sylvia, open bracket and introduction, close bracket, Putting the Dog to Sleep, Doppelganger, Revisited, and Endless Ladder.
Wonderful. So my discography ranking for the Antlers is at the bottom, Uprooted. In 5th place, I will put Burst Apart. In 4th place, I will put In the Attic of the Universe. In 3rd place, I'll put Hospice. In 2nd place, Undersea. And in 1st place, Familiars. And my 10 favorite Antlers tracks, 10 is Corsicana, 9 is 2, 8 is Putting the Dog to Sleep, 7 is Intruders, 6 is The Universe is Going to Catch You, 5 is Drift Dive, 4 is Sylvia, 3 is Director, 2 is Stairs to the Attic, and 1 is Palace.
Discography ranking. I already wrote it. I'm just going to read it exactly how I wrote it. I've got the Cold War EP at the bottom. Uprooted is my lowest ranked full album. Then New York Hospitals, the solo album Impermanence, and then back to the normal ranking. So Uprooted, Burst Apart, In the Attic of the Universe, Familiars, Hospice, Undersea. And for the top 10 tracks, 10 Director, 9 Endless Ladder, 8 Palace, 7 2, 6 Stairs to the Attic, 5 Every Night My Teeth Are Falling Out, 4 Parade, 3 Zelda, 2 Wake, and number 1 Kettering.
Wonderful. Okay, well that wraps up our latest discography deep dive. Well done, everybody. But if you're still listening at home, let us know in the comments what your favorite Antlers record is. What are your favorite Antlers song? What does this band mean to you? And have we kind of touched on any nerves? Have you felt that we've missed any potential readings or information? Please let us know. We love interaction, and follow us on Twitter if you haven't already. And we will be back again very soon with more new reviews. Stick around, of course, for our review of Green to Gold when that hits. And yeah, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Microsoft. Be what's next.